In our 5th place position, we have my favorite creepy doll, Annabelle. Back when I was in high school, I actually got to portray her in a local haunted house, which was the beginning of my scare acting career. Hey, I promise I am quite terrifying if I want to be. I promise. For those of you who might be rolling their eyes right now, I'm going to refresh memories on the real Annabelle story. So feel free to cozy up and listen. Donna and Angie were student nurses and good friends who had decided to room together while in school. And for Donna's 28th birthday, her mom had gifted her a very large Raggedy Ann doll, something she was thrilled about. Personally, I'd react the same way. Let the record know that I'm always down to accept gifts of dolls or plushies. Soon after adopting the precious doll, Donna started to notice some weird behavior. She would leave Annabelle in her bed every morning behind her locked bedroom door, seating her the same way with her arms and legs crossed, and would come home at night to Annabelle having moved rooms and in positions that weren't possible. She's described a few instances of the doll kneeling, and speaking from experience, stuffed dolls can't kneel without falling for more than a few seconds. Donna and Angie then started finding notes left throughout the apartment, written on parchment paper in red pen. 2 things they didn't own. When Donna's boyfriend Lou started criticizing the doll, unexplainable handprints and scratches began appearing on his body. And that's when the girls made the decision to call a priest, who then brought in the Warrens. They were able to calm down the entity enough to remove it from the home and transport her to their museum, where she resides to this day. Now, the footage I'm talking about here is from the visitors who have visited Annabelle in her current residence over the years. If you look closely, you can just see the energy that's alive in her. Also, if she was never removed from her box until like the last few years, how is she able to change position ever so slightly from one video to the next? You tell me here. In 4th place, we have footage from a Buddhist exorcism. Known as parita, which can be translated as protection or safeguard, it refers to the Buddhist practice of reciting certain verses and scriptures in order to ward off misfortune or danger. The practice of reciting or listening to the parita suttas began very early in the history of Buddhism. The Mahavamsa contains the earliest historical reference to this practice, describing how Upatissa I instructed monks to recite the Ratana Sutta throughout the night during a period when Sri Lanka was afflicted by plague and diseases. In the Pali literature, these short verses are recommended by the Buddha as providing protection from certain afflictions. The belief in the effective power to heal or protect of the Sakakariya, or asseveration of something quite true, is an aspect of the work ascribed to the Parita. It is also widely believed that all-night recitations of Parita by monks bring safety, peace, and well-being to a community. Parita discourses can be recited at events like a funeral or on the death anniversary of a loved one, and can also be recited to placate antagonistic spirits. In 1987, Ed and Lorraine took a trip to Japan to offer their expertise in some cases that were ongoing in different parts of the country, with one of their stops being to a Buddhist temple. Describing everyone they encountered as lovely, Ed and Lorraine were shocked when they came upon not 1, but 2 people under possession. Ed described one as being under the influence of a snake demon, as they slithered around the floor constantly with their tongue darting in and out of their mouth. The possessed people were blindfolded, so the demons couldn't witness the rites, as the Buddhas went through the rituals and chanted around them. After the spirits were cast out, a bonfire was built to help guide them towards the afterlife. The footage we see is from a later round of prayers, which was held because one of the sets of spirits refused initially to depart from her attached soul. You can hear Lorraine attempting to guide the spirit out with the aid of a translator, coaxing Teresa to go on to the light and fly away, that her family was no longer here. In 3rd place, we have the Warner Brothers Jungle Habitat. Originally opening on July 19th of 1972, this now abandoned park closed its doors by 1976, which is a really bad timeline for a theme park that was technically never completed. The first time Jungle Habitat made headlines was only months after it first opened for business, when an Israeli tourist named Abraham Levy was riding through the safari in a taxicab and decided to roll down the window to get a better look at some of the animals roaming around. 2 lions attacked the car and mauled the 26-year-old tourist, causing lacerations to his face and shoulder. He took credit for the harm, citing his own foolishness, which helped to dodge, I guess, like a media onslaught. For the most part. By the end of the year, reports of animals escaping into the wilds of West Milford, which is where the park is located, were far too many in volume to be ignored. Besides the sightings of harmless animals like peacocks, there were numerous rumors spreading about dangerous animals such as like a pack of wolves and a lion being sighted along like local roads. Okay, look, I grew up in the land of moose, and I wouldn't want to see one of those on the side of the highway. I can't imagine seeing a lion on the side of one. These sentiments voiced way back in the day are identical to the rumors still running rampant today. Tales told by local residents who have, looked out into their backyards include wandering ostriches and a band of baboons running amok in the town's pharmacy. Guess they needed a prescription filled. Emus, baboons, and even wolves are just some of the uncaged critters which have been known to actually have escaped the park. I feel like I found the origins for the Night at the Museum franchise. On July 8th of 1974, a 68-year-old visitor from Long Island was grabbed by the trunk of a baby elephant, which then slammed her against a fence and bit her. The woman, her name's Elizabeth Ennis by the way, was later awarded $200,000 by a court. In an account in the New York Times, she claimed the elephant bit her on the right hand, and because of the trauma incurred by being slammed into the fence, she had persistent pain in her right side that prevented her from lifting heavy items. Her husband was awarded $5,000 for the loss of companionship. I'm just glad that's all that she went through. Goodness, elephants are pretty big. The animals also had a tendency to damage the cars that passed through, and a museum for the park that exists online now says that the tigers like to bite and pop car tires, and monkeys like to rip antennas off the cars. Sounds like a lack of good animal training and boundaries to me, but I'm no animal expert. Right after the park closed in October of 1976, some of the animal carcasses were left outside. This pile grew until, 30 animal bodies, including that of an elephant, a bison, a camel, and some zebras, were all left lying until April, when the ground had thawed enough to finally bury what was left of them. The 6 months that they were left exposed was a violation of state laws, which stated that any animal should be buried within 48 hours of its passing. Despite this violation, Warner Brothers were not sanctioned. Jungle habitat is gone now, but never forgotten. Reports of mysterious kangaroo sightings in remote corners of West Milford still turn up from time to time. Be careful, kangaroos hurt. In second place, we have the Joyland deaths. Located in Wichita, Kansas, Joyland once featured state-of-the-art rides and attractions, holding a reign of 55 years of fun and joy. Today, the once popular park is being reclaimed by nature, piece by piece by piece by piece. Joyland came into existence on June 12th of 1949. It was founded by Lester Ottaway and his sons, Herbert and Harold. Now, Herb had a passion for steam engines and race cars, and he refurbished both types of vehicles. By 1934, Herb Ottaway had refurbished a miniature steam locomotive and cars, and was traveling with them to county fairs in Kansas and Colorado. Joyland was originally opened to give Herb's refurbished locomotive a more permanent home. As the attraction became more popular, the Ottoways eventually added a number of different rides and games to the amusement park. Now, Lester Ottaway passed away in the mid-1950s, but his sons continued running Joyland until the early 1970s, when they decided to, retire. Joyland was then sold to Stanley and Margaret Nelson, who owned the park until it closed its doors in 2004. Joyland featured attractions such as a wooden roller coaster, my personal favorite kind of coaster, a wacky shack dark ride, a log jam, a sky coaster, bumper cars, the classic carousel, and of course, a Ferris wheel. Now, on April 6th of 2004, a 13-year-old girl was enjoying a Ferris wheel ride with her friends when the restraint bar holding them in came undone. The young girl fell more than 30 feet, suffering multiple head, arm, and leg injuries, and it's a miracle that she survived. The Ferris wheel was immediately closed, while both private and federal investigations looked into whether everything was, safe and up to code. The ride managed to, reopen eventually after these investigations were wrapped up, so okay, I wonder what to code means anymore. Another notable ride at Joyland was the wooden roller coaster that was known as the Nightmare. Although the roller coaster was a staple at the amusement park, it too saw its fair share of injuries. On May 25th of 1977, one rider stood up in one of these carts and fell. He passed at the scene from injuries sustained from the fall. Another death occurred 20 years later on August 27th of 1998 when a 35-year-old maintenance worker named Kevin Briley was under the ride trimming the grass. He stood up and was tragically hit by the roller coaster. He also died at the scene from his injuries. My heart hurts telling that tale because I'm such a huge lover of traditional wooden roller coasters. There's just something about narrowly avoiding whiplash that I personally find thrilling. Joyland closed its doors in 2004. Maybe it might be worth, a little urban exploration. In first place, time to visit the ghosts of the Enchanted Forest. The whimsical 20-acre amusement park was built in an Oregon forest and boasted handcrafted attractions like Storybook Lane and Toftville Western Town, along with rides like the Ice Cream Mountain bobsled roller coaster and a big timber log ride. Sounds pretty magical, right? Yeah, that all depends on who you ask. Though many folks experience nothing more than a charming park, other more abnormal experiences are definitely not in line with a regular amusement park. For many, a visit to the Enchanted Forest can be a supernatural phenomenon, and I know I'd be happy either way. I love all things fantastical and wonderful and whimsical, but also spooky. Tales of employees feeling a ghostly presence on attractions like the Haunted House and Challenge of Mondor ride caught my eye while doing research for today. The story of Enchanted Forest starts with Roger Toft, the park's creator, who spent every last penny he had to make his passion project come to life in 1971. His granddaughter, Ashley Toft, is now the park's general manager, and while she claims she's personally never experienced any supernatural phenomena on the Haunted House, she did admit that the attraction makes her feel feel anxious and overwhelmed. While guiding a group of experienced paranormal experts through the attraction, she led them directly to a cold spot that could be attributed to an otherworldly presence. As much as I understand the stigma of not wanting to believe in ghosts, that's a coincidence I can't just ignore. Challenge of Mondor ride operator Chris Dunn has since told a tale of an inexplicable encounter that he experienced one morning in 2016 while prepping the wizard-themed target aiming attraction for the day. He explained how he heard footsteps behind him, but turned around. No one there. Mere seconds after hearing the footsteps, he described being hit with a strange energy throughout his body, one that made him dizzy and gave him a horrible case of chills. Now later in the day, the same thing happened, but with more intensity. He took photos of the ride not in operation and captured images of what looks to be an orb that changes shapes in 3 sequential photos. The team of investigators I mentioned before were granted permission to spend a night unsupervised at the park and experience the chilling energy and the Challenge of Mondor and managed to communicate with a spirit in the haunted house. Notice how I haven't mentioned a park tragedy yet as the cause for anything? That's because, unlike the other places on this list, there wasn't one. The haunted house was built during the original construction along with the rest of attractions, and Challenge of Mondor was constructed in 2006. Time to borrow that time machine I've been asking the powers that be for, and travel on back. In August of 1846, Oregon settlers and indigenous tribes of the Willamette Valley fought a terrible battle in present-day Salem, known as Battle Creek. The theory most people believe is that the energy could be the cause of the manifestation in the theme park, which was built in close proximity to the gruesome fight. You let me know what you think down in the comments.
At number 5, the trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson. Also known as the Devil Made Me Do It case, this is the first recorded court case in United States history that used demonic possession as basis for a defendant's claim that had ultimately resulted in the first-degree manslaughter of Connecticut man Alan Bono. It began with the Glatzel family after their 11-year-old son David had allegedly been possessed by a demonic beast who assaulted him in an attic. This manifested itself as David began to experience night terrors, exhibit strange behaviour and fall victim to unexplained wounds, scratches and bruises. Of course, after calling upon the services of a Catholic priest and finding no resolution, the family contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren. Soon after, Lorraine witnessed a black mist around David, an apparent indication of demonic involvement, as well as red hand marks around his neck, a demon choking him. The Warrens attempted to perform 3 exorcisms on the boy, where during one attempt the demon spoke out and said that David's stepfather, Arne Johnson, would commit a murder when the demonic host would go on to possess him itself. Well, that's exactly what happened, strangely enough, and Arne Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He still maintains that he was possessed by a demon to this day, despite the court not believing so. Coming in at number 4, The Werewolf of London. Well, that's a title if I've ever heard one. Do you know anything about lycanthropy? The supernatural transformation of a person into a wolf? On the other hand, scientifically speaking, defined as clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric disorder that involves the delusion of bestial transformation, often exhibited as a wolf. Meet Bill Ramsey, a London man or wolf who had allegedly demonstrated demonically possessed lycan behaviour since the age of 9. In 1983, as a grown man, he admitted himself to an institution desperate to get help for his affliction. According to Bill, he would display superhuman strength and feel a rabid, frenzied urge to bite his family and relatives before succumbing to a strange seizure and convulsion. While in hospital, Bill had an overwhelming craving for blood and went on to attack a nurse while barking like a dog. A few years later, after being released from hospital, he went into a wolf-like rage and attacked a police officer with superhuman force. It took 6 more police officers to finally restrain the beast, leading to widespread news coverage and mass hysteria of a werewolf in London. Of course, this caught the attention of Ed and Lorraine, and they flew him out to Connecticut, performed an exorcism on the wolf demon, and he was right as rain. Job done. Everyone's a winner. Allegedly. Next up
in 3rd place, we have a Scream knockoff. While Taylor was in her last year of university, she was determined to make extra money and decided to post ads online for babysitting and dog walking services, adding photos of herself and her phone number in an attempt to appear as legitimate as possible. Roughly an hour after finalizing her posting, Taylor was cooking herself dinner and heard her cell phone ringing from where she left it in her upstairs bedroom. Sadly, she couldn't retrieve it immediately since, she was handling a lot of hot pans, so she let it ring out. A few minutes later, it began to ring again, and when she didn't retrieve that call either, whoever it was called back, and repeatedly until she was finally able to leave her pans and bolt upstairs to answer it. When she picked up, all that she could hear was heavy breathing, so after she didn't get a reply, she hung up, but the phone rang again the moment she put it down. Annoyed by this point, and I would be too, Taylor picked up once again, this time finally encountering a male voice. The conversation began normally, so Taylor assumed that the call before was just a bad connection. He explained that he had a duo of very young offspring and wanted to know if she thought she could handle that responsibility. Taylor informed him that she had experienced dealing with poorly behaved clientele before and assured the man that she could handle what he was describing. The man followed up by asking if she could do any overnights, and this is where the red flag started to kick in for Taylor. Dang, I should have brought one today with me to count them off. Oh well, just imagine it, right here. Whee! Thanks to common sense kicking in, she firmly said that she would not babysit overnight and was met with only heavy breathing in response. She asked if he was still there, and after a period of silence, the voice asked, "Are you a virgin?" Taylor, completely stunned, hung up the phone immediately. The phone kept ringing nonstop for the next hour. The awful man had withheld his number, so she couldn't specifically block that number at first, but then eventually found the function to block withheld numbers on her phone, did it, deleted her number from the ad site, and went on to message every other person on there in her local area with a babysitting ad to warn them, finding out that this caller was a common annoyance or rite of passage to those who had listed their numbers. Poor Taylor was so scared that she was jumping at every shadow for the rest of the evening. In second place, we have the end of a life. Sheila Schrock was a teenage orphan who lived with her older brother in Birmingham, Michigan, an attractive and affluent community. Sheila was babysitting in an upstairs room of a house at 1772 Villa Street early in the evening of January 19th of 1976 when she was surprised by a man who had just come from breaking into 3 other houses in the neighborhood, holding a pry bar and a screwdriver. Her assailant, described by a witness as a thin young white male, somewhere between the ages of 18 to 25, around 5'10" or 6 feet, with a sparse beard, prominent nose, pointed chin, removed her clothing, forcibly fornicated with her, and as this horrified neighbor witness watched from a nearby roof from which he was shoveling snow, ended her with a series of shots from a semi-automatic. That's specific. Allegedly, the attacker looted the home, making off with a firearm, jewelry, and blended in with the crowd on the street to escape. The eyewitness described the vehicle as a 1967 Cadillac, and even with all this detailing, he has never been apprehended. Poor Sheila. Like, that is such a specific remembrance of somebody's face, and even with all that, you can't apprehend him? Dang. In first place, we have a complete kidnapping. On October 24th of 1953, Viggo Rasmussen, a professor at La Crosse State College in Wisconsin, hired Evelyn Hartley, the daughter of a fellow professor, to take care of his own very young daughter. That evening, Evelyn's father Richard called the Rasmussen house several times after she failed to check in as planned around 8:30 p.m. and was met with no answer each time. Concerned, he drove to the house, and when he arrived, the doors were locked, the lights and radio were on, and items were scattered all over the house. The living room furniture had been moved around to different places, ditto for Evelyn's school books. Richard found her shoes in different rooms, with one shoe upstairs and another downstairs. He also found his daughter's broken glasses upstairs, but no sign of his actual daughter anywhere in the home. During the search of the house, Richard observed that every room that could be locked was in fact locked, minus a basement room at the back of the house that had an opened window that was missing a screen. The missing screen was located outside of the room in the backyard, leaning against a short step ladder. Pry marks were found on some of the windows, and footprints have been found in areas of the house, along with traces of red fluid, leading to red handprints, on the garage that was over 100 feet away. Oddly enough, the charge Evelyn was watching was still fast asleep and unharmed. Police believe someone took Evelyn through the yard, but dropped her on the ground before carrying her further, and this was supported by the police dogs who tracked her scent trail that ended 2 blocks away, where it's assumed that she was tossed into a vehicle, just like a sack of potatoes. They were told by one neighbor that they had seen a car repeatedly driving around the neighborhood, and another person who lived nearby claimed they had heard screams an hour earlier, assuming it was just from local kids playing. Now, before anyone calls out nonsense on that, have you heard kids playing in the neighborhood? That gets loud. 2 days after the incident, local resident Ed Hoffer told police that while driving his vehicle, he was almost hit by a dark green, two-tone 1942 Buick as it was speeding in a westerly direction. So for me, I'm like, okay, green car? Inside the Buick, Ed reported seeing one man was driving the vehicle, while a second man was in the backseat with a girl. Ed also reported that a few minutes before the incident, he had seen the same 2 men with the young girl as he was pulling outside his brother-in-law's house, located conveniently around the corner from the Rasmussen house. Ed stated that the girl was wedged between the 2 men, and he had thought that she was, intoxicated, as the 2 men were holding her by the arms as they were walking down the street. Now, if you think this all sounds a little too suspicious and made up, you're not alone. The police did bring in Ed as a suspect, but sadly he passed 2 lie detector tests, and no remains or DNA were found on his property. Some folks, such as myself, are pretty sure he had something to do with all of this.
Starting us off in at number 5, psychic photos. If you're a fan of our channel, you may remember a video that we did on the eerie objects and artifacts that you can observe at Ed and Lorraine's Occult Museum in Connecticut. Well, here they go into detail about one particular type of creepy object that they have a handful of at their museum: psychic photographs. So what are psychic photographs? According to Ed Warren, a psychic photo is a phenomenon in which a camera, being an impartial witness, captures a ghost on film. But the crazy thing is that the image that you see of the ghost is one that it projects itself, an image of what it believes it looks like. This clip explores how exactly that happens, and the Warrens describe instances in which they've witnessed spirit forms appearing beyond the physical eye. Ed also tells of how he captured the White Lady of Union Graveyard with his camera, one of their most famous images.
We could put the first slide up and look at it. Wow.
Well, there you're seeing your stereotype ghost. Look at the appendage-like arms and legs. You know, when you see these little cute ghosts that are painted and drawn on Halloween, this is your stereotype ghost right here.
And at number 4, the Amityville House. This piece of footage, published by Mysterious World, features Lorraine Warren retelling her experience at the Amityville House. The Warrens in the past had gone to the famous Amityville House. It's one of their most famous cases. It's the place in which a man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 family members of his in 1974. And a year later, a new family, the Lutz family, had moved into the residence, only to be terrorized by a violent demonic presence. The Warrens had visited the house in an attempt to help the Lutz family, part of which was adapted into the 2016 movie The Conjuring 2. In this video clip, we get more insight on what the real-life events that occurred there were like. Lorraine tells her interview that, I quote, "Places like Amity, if you gave me $1 billion, I wouldn't go in that house again, because it messed up my life and my husband's life." She also tells the interviewer that the Amityville house was where she levitated, which is pretty creepy.
Number 3, the Skeptical Society. I think a little healthy skepticism is good for all of us, even on a paranormal channel. I watch paranormal stuff every single day of my life, but I like to approach it from a skeptical angle. What can I say? I'm more of a Scully than I am a Mulder. The New England Society for Paranormal Research isn't the only group in New England that was involved with the Warrens. Enter the New England Skeptical Society, existing as a bit of a rival to the Warrens. The Skeptical Society existed to uphold the tenets of science and reason versus paranormal speculation. The founder, one Stephen Novello, was a prominent neurologist and professor at Yale School of Medicine, and he did not think particularly highly of the Warrens. He was quoted saying, "You meet them, and oh my god, you realize the guy had no idea what he was doing, didn't know the first thing about anything relevant to paranormal investigation or ghost phenomena." He was adamantly not a fan of the Warrens at all, even going so far as to decry their Museum of the Occult and Cursed Objects, referring to it as little more than off-the-shelf Halloween junk, dolls, and toys. Now, the Warrens refused to allow the Skeptical Society to shadow them on a case or investigation numerous times, apparently, with various excuses each time. When sufficiently questioned about it, Ed Warren responded, "You can't have scientific evidence for a spiritual phenomenon." An outright investigation by the society printed in a newspaper read, "The Warrens claim to have scientific evidence which does indeed prove the existence of ghosts," which sounds like a feasible claim into which we can sink our investigative teeth. Now, what we found was a nice couple. Some sincere people, but absolutely no compelling evidence. Number 2, the White Lady Ghost. Continuing on with the Skeptical Society, the frequent detractor of the Warrens, many critics of the Warrens have noted their consistent lack of evidence for their cases. They've got a museum of cursed objects and haunted relics, but they don't seem to have any actual hard evidence of ghosts. The most prominent bit of evidence that they've ever put forward was a photo from the Amityville horror case allegedly depicting a ghost descending a staircase, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest the Amityville case was a fraud as a whole, and should probably be questioned reasonably. One infamous ghost Ed Warren claimed to have seen was that of the White Lady Ghost, a ghost dressed in all white that haunted the Union Cemetery. Stephen Novello repeatedly questioned Ed, saying that if they had this video footage of a ghost somewhere, that it doesn't make sense why you wouldn't release that footage publicly to silence any critics or doubters. Eventually, Stephen was invited to the Warrens' home to watch the tape and was sufficiently unimpressed. Why don't you take a little listen to his review after watching the clip. The piece de resistance of the museum is Ed's video of the White Lady of Union Cemetery in Easton, Connecticut. We've only been allowed to view this tape in the Warrens' home because Ed refused to give it to us to analyze, a common theme in our investigations. The tape shows a white human figure moving behind some tombstones. Like videos of UFOs, Bigfoot, and the Loch Ness Monster, the figure is at the perfect distance and resolution so that a provocative shape can be seen, but no details which would aid identification. Ed Warren has not investigated this video with any rigor and refuses to allow others to do so. Despite Ed's insistence that he was engaged in research, he continued to jealously hoard his evidence rather than allow it to be analyzed. Now, detractors like Novella have suggested that the footage in question has been faked and it was just someone in a sheet. This footage actually is available now. After decades and decades of just talking about it, you can see the footage for yourself. It's available now on their son-in-law's personal YouTube channel after Ed had passed, and I will admit it is a bit blurry. It is kind of hard to make out anything. Number 1, the Amityville hoax. Now, besides The Conjuring, one of the biggest cases the Warrens were ever involved in was the Amityville horror. Before the Conjuring cinematic universe kicked off and they made 3 Annabelle movies, they were making films and books about the Amityville story. It gripped America as it was a truly bizarre, haunting case. Well, except for the fact that there seems like there's a big pile of evidence to suggest the case was greatly exaggerated for the cameras and media. The book was a bestseller, and the movie was a hit, but take a listen to some smaller inaccuracies. For one, the Lutz claimed that they found demonic footprints in the snow, but weather records around the time of the incident showed there was no snowfall. The book and the film also both refer to police being called to the house, but no records show that police were ever contacted during this time. Perhaps most incriminating is William Weber, who is the attorney for Ronald DeFeo, has claimed multiple times that the entire story was all a hoax collaboratively created between the Lutz family, novelist Jay Anson, and the Warrens. This wouldn't even be the first time it seemed like the Warrens were more interested in a good story than the truth. The Haunting in Connecticut story was written into a non-fiction novel by Ray Garton, a horror novelist who was commissioned by the Warrens to tell the story. He claims that he found the experience very frustrating as an author because while he was trying to report on the story, the Snedeker family involved in the case could not keep their details straight and were providing several conflicting stories. He pressed Ed Warren on it, and Ed told him, "They're crazy. All the people who come to us are crazy, that's why they come to us. Just use what you can and make the rest up. You write scary books, right? Well, just make it up and make it scary. That's why we hired you."
Kicking us off in 5th place, we have water park troubles. This tale takes place at Schlitterbahn, which is a theme park owned by Cedar Fair in Texas on the Raging Rapids portion of the Lazy River. Our narrator Vanessa and her friends didn't expect anything intense from the ride. They were all just, looking forward to relaxing, watching the water go by, enjoying the scenery. As expected, the ride wasn't super intense whatsoever at first, until it hit a patch of white water, and because of the angle that the raft hit the bump, Vanessa and her companions were launched into the river. Nope, that's not supposed to be part of the ride. And while the ride might have only been, 3 feet or so deep of water, I'm reminded of all the posters from my local pool growing up about how people can literally drown in a bathtub. So yikes. Vanessa described herself as entering a state of shock, feeling emotions ranging from fright to embarrassment, confusion, and panic. As she attempted to reach for the raft to pull herself back in, she realized she couldn't see her friends anywhere, and she was once again being yanked underwater. Panic had taken over as the main emotion by this point, and Vanessa found herself swirling around and around and around under the water. Thankfully, a nearby lifeguard jumped into action and was able to hoist Vanessa and her friends back into their raft, allowing them to enjoy the rest of the rapids in the intended fashion. I'm a little concerned about the lack of seatbelts on that ride since they were never mentioned, and I feel like that should be a thing, or like a weight sensor to stop the ride in event that, someone goes over. Oh, just me, okay. As a high point to this, somehow Vanessa managed to keep her glasses on throughout the entire ordeal. Go Vanessa! In 4th place, we have an urban legend from Canada's Wonderland. Time to move on to a Cedar Fair park that's a little closer to home. As someone who spends most of September through December at Canada's Wonderland every year, I just knew I had to include this ghost story in today's list. While Wonderland might be home to the scariest of scary monsters every October, the iconic Wonder Mountain is actually home to a ghostly spirit all year round. Construction of the iconic theme park happened between 1979 until 1981, with construction of the mountain alone involving a dozen local companies under Cincinnati engineer Curtis D. Summers. Now, while we don't know the name of our victim, one of the construction workers who was working on Wonder Mountain passed on the job, and for the most part, the details of his passing and specifics have been kept pretty secret. I tried. I promise I tried. This ghostie haunts the mountain to this day, specifically the Thunder Run ride. If the ride operators don't greet the area with good morning and good night at the beginning and the end of each operating day, the ride will malfunction and cease operations until given the proper respect. Honestly, I'm all for inviting the ghost to roam the park during Halloween haunt. What's the worst that could happen? An actual ghost over in Ghostly Pines or Spirit Manor would be so much fun to see. Oh, just my own opinion again? Of course.
Moving on to number 3, the Halloween Room. This video starts off as a cute little tour of Ed Warren's Halloween Room, which was attached to the Occult Museum. It's a nice little look at the collection of fun items that fans and friends have given him over the years, knowing how much he loves Halloween. But that's where the cuteness ends. From there, the tour goes into darker territory. Unlike many of the other tour videos we've seen of the Occult Museum, this tour has no background music, and it's pretty eerie. We hear Ed go on about how the Occult Museum is likely one of the most haunted places in the world. Ed says that it's not a building that anyone should be allowed in between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., and how many of the objects in the room have resulted in people being maimed or killed, or resulted in individuals' sanity being harmed severely, with some having to go to mental institutions as an after effect of their encounter with these objects, all of which he claims are evil in some way. Moving on to number 2, the tour. Here we have footage from the Bearfort Paranormal's tour at the Occult Museum. It's a 15-minute walkthrough of the museum that feels like you're right there with the visitors, and gives viewers a very up-close and personal look at the objects featured. You can hear a lot of narration concerning the origins of many of the items that are visible too. Plus, a lot of it is shot through a camera using some sort of night vision feature, hence why the lighting at parts is so green and freaky. It just kinda makes it spookier. And finally, in at number 1, Moving Annabelle. We featured this video clip on one of our other recent lists about the famous Annabelle doll at the museum. It's the real-life footage of Tony Spira, the son-in-law of Lorraine Warren, moving the Annabelle doll from her original case into a new, more secure and portable case. So yeah, doll came out of the case, was exposed to the elements. Very creepy if you believe in Annabelle. So he starts off the video by doing a series of prayers, and after other precautionary measures are taken, Annabelle is gently moved from one holding area to the next. Tony then conducts a binding spell. The whole video is a little nerve-wracking, and many an individual who has watched it has claimed to see the doll moving ever so slightly at various points of the 10-minute and 8-second clip.
Coming in at 5, the South End Werewolf. This is perhaps the most unusual case on our list. This investigation took the Warrens out of the US into a seaside town in Essex, England, where a man named Bill Ramsey lived, who was believed to be possessed by a demon that manifested as a wolf. Backstory: growing up, Ramsey was a normal kid. However, one day at the age of 9, he suddenly began to exhibit inhuman qualities. One report stated that while playing outside in his backyard, Ramsey felt a frigid cold overtake him. He was overcome with an awful stench before flying into a rage and uprooting a fence post, gnawing on its wire meshing. He remained incident-free up until the 1960s, during which time he was plagued with nightmares, cold sweats, and began to wake up panting like a wild animal. In the 1980s, Bill would become overwhelmed by the sensations he experienced when he was young, and at one point he attacked a friend in a car on their way home from a pub, and manhandled the police in an intense altercation. The Warrens were of course called in, during which time they stated that Ramsey would ask to be locked up in a jail cell for his protection, and the protection of the public. They ended up asking Ramsey to come to their Connecticut home, where Bishop Robert McKenna would perform a recorded exorcism on Ramsey. In at 4, Aunt Cheyenne Johnson. The trial of Aunt Cheyenne Johnson is baffling, and the first known case in the US that used the devil made me do it as its defense. On the night of February 16, 1981, Johnson, who was just 19 years old at the time, was out for dinner with his fiancée and their landlord Alan Bono. Johnson stabbed Bono multiple times using his pocket knife, and later went on to plead not guilty by possession, a defense that was founded on Johnson's relationship with his fiancée's brother, David. In 1980, David woke up to what he described as a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features and jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hoofs. The demon-like creature scared David so much that he turned to his sister Ann Johnson for help. They turned to a priest, which only angered the entity more, causing it to make David hiss and quote Paradise Lost. The Warrens were brought in, and during one particular interview they stated, I quote, "While Ed interviewed the boy, I saw a black misty form next to him, which told me we were dealing with something of a negative nature. Soon the child was complaining that invisible hands were choking him, and there were red marks on him. He said that he had a feeling of being hit. The Warrens worked alongside 4 priests to exorcise more than 40 demons from David. However, Johnson seemed to be the new target, and after he stabbed his landlord, he was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter after his claims of possession didn't hold up in court. Coming in at 3, Annabelle the doll. This case follows the now infamous Annabelle doll, a Raggedy Ann doll that was purchased in an antique store. It was gifted to the buyer's daughter, a nursing student. However, the student and her roommate very quickly began to notice odd occurrences involving the doll, including her changing positions and even leaving notes. Horrible. The messages eventually escalated and blood even appeared on the doll's dress. Annabelle seemed to take aim at the fiancé of one of the roommates, who claims he woke up one night frozen in bed as the doll crawled up his body and tried to strangle him. He also claimed that upon entering a dark room where the doll was sat, he felt something attack him. When he turned on the lights, he saw his stomach covered in bloody scratches, with the doll now on the floor. The Warrens were eventually called in, and they explained that the doll was possessed by the spirit of a deceased 7-year-old girl named Annabelle Higgins, which supposedly died on the land where the apartment stood. However, it was later determined by the Warrens that a demonic presence was in fact behind the doll. They ended up performing a blessing in the home before taking Annabelle and housing her in the Warrens Occult Museum. Coming in at 2, the Amityville case. This is perhaps the Warrens' most famous paranormal case, with the investigation being adapted into many frightening and unending films. The case involved the Lutz family, who took up residence in a suburban home in Amityville, Long Island in 1975, just 1 year after a deadly mass murder occurred on the property, which saw Ronald DeFeo Jr. brutally kill 6 members of his family. For 28 days, the Lutzes were antagonized by spirits. They heard voices, saw swarms of flies, and were inflicted with welts. The Warrens were eventually called in to cleanse the home, bringing with them a local TV crew. While there, they snapped a handful of pictures, including one that seemed to show a boy with glowing eyes. The Warrens ultimately determined that the land was cursed, and Lorraine considered it to be the one case that continuously haunted her, stating, "Amityville was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. It followed us right straight across the country. I will never go in the Amityville house ever again." End quote. And lastly, coming in at number 1, the Perron family haunting. This now infamous case follows the Perrons, a family that moved to an idyllic 200-acre home in Harrisville, Rhode Island, a home that hid some very dark and disturbing secrets. The home was originally built in 1736 and was inhabited by Bathsheba Thayer and her 4 children, 3 of whom died young. The deaths and circumstances around the deaths drew in a lot of suspicion within the town, resulting in them ostracizing Bathsheba, who was ultimately labeled a Satanist by her community. She then went on to hang herself in her own backyard. Now, during the parents' stay at the home, they experienced a lot of ghostly interactions, including spirits playing with her children. Bathsheba also appeared to them, only she was far more menacing than the children that haunted the residence. They heard disembodied voices and watched on as furniture moved on its own. The Perron family also stated that Bathsheba targeted the mother, Carolyn, and was jealous of her motherhood. The Warrens were ultimately brought in to help the family in 1974. However, the presence only worsened the situation, so much so that the family asked the Warrens to leave.
In 5th place, time to visit a haunted house. Our lovely narrator Claire was familiar with the family, with her mom having taught the would-be clients in preschool, and was asked to cover a shift whenever the regular sitter was unavailable. Over the course of one evening in particular, 4 odd things happened. Let's count them down, shall we? First, the boys were pulling out food for dinner, and they set a container of salsa on the counter. Minutes later, while prepping food, the container burst and sent salsa flying all across the room, all over the walls, the cabinets, and the fridge. Odd, but Claire assumed it was just kind of old and some gas had built up in the container. I can't imagine that was fun to clean. Well, while she was cleaning it and the boys were in the kitchen helping her, they all heard a loud thud in the living room. Rushing as a group into the other room, they saw that 2 framed photos on opposite walls had fallen to the floor at the same time. Neither of them appeared damaged, but they both landed right on the floor. Claire propped them up against the walls, but left them alone. Weird. Later, when the entire posse was upstairs, Claire was waiting in the hallway while the boys took turns in the bathroom taking their evening showers, and suddenly she heard a weird dinging sound. She walked down the hallway and noticed that the computer in the study was turning on and off and making all sorts of weird noises. Sure, there are explanations for that, but after all the other events, Claire was very much on edge, and rightfully so. She finally got the boys to bed and went downstairs to watch TV for the rest of the time until the parents got home. As she was sitting in the living room, trying to relax her racing brain, she heard footsteps upstairs, and that's number 4. Assuming the boys had gotten up, she tiptoed upstairs to check. Their bedroom door was closed, and when she peeked inside, both boys were fast asleep in their beds. Claire went back downstairs, and within minutes, she heard the creaking yet again. The boys never called out to her, and there wasn't any noise besides that. She didn't report anything else weird happening, but I would recommend a deep spiritual cleanse of the house if I were that family. Just my 2 cents. In 4th place, we have a case of moving dolls. As someone who collects creepy dolls, this story definitely intrigued me from the get-go. Here's the thing with dolls with a personality, okay? They have to be treated with respect, carefully preserved, and be in a quasi-emotionally stable environment, or else weird things are, they're gonna happen. Don't worry, I promise a video on my personal creepy doll collection is coming soon. I'm just waiting on one of them to be ready to take a day trip to be on camera. It's a whole thing, but we respect boundaries. Where was I again? Oh, right. Poor Ashley. She arrived at the Lanford house one night, ready for what she thought was a typical babysitting evening. Upon encountering Sarah, mother of Kelly, she realized that poor Kelly was indexed within an inch of her life. Sarah had prepared a thoroughly detailed binder of everything Ashley would ever need to know about Kelly, and more. From a tab explicitly spelling out Kelly's allergies, to her every phobia, each show she was allowed to watch on TV and when they'd be on, and more. It took a while for Ashley to scoot Sarah out the door, but when she did, Ashley breathed a sigh of relief, wondering if the night was going to be an easy evening, or what the heck had she gotten herself into. Going through the binder herself, she observed that it was indeed supper time, in accordance with the minute-accurate schedule, and began following the precise instructions, prepping the water pot to boil. I would never be able to follow a minute schedule. No, thank you. While she waited for the water to, do its thing, Kelly offered to introduce her to the dolls that were in the living room, and Ashley happily accepted, hoping to figure out if the ward was genuinely neurotic or just a poor victim of extreme helicopter parenting. Kelly introduced Ashley to each doll in great detail, and then began to act out scenarios, pretending as if the dolls were alive and out to hurt her. Now look, I'm not gonna pretend I was a normal kid, but I don't think I put my Barbies in a scenario to end my life. I'm thinking, yeah, I don't think so. Poor Ashley ran for the binder, flipping through the phobia and usual behavior sections in an attempt to see if there was a way to placate the situation, when suddenly, Kelly stopped, as if nothing had happened. Ashley tried prompting her, seeing what had taken over, but nothing. By this point, the pot in the kitchen had finally reached a boil, and Ashley turned her attention to making dinner, hoping that sticking to the schedule would avoid any further weird behavior. After supper was over, and Kelly was watching one of the pre-approved shows on the list, Ashley noticed that some of the dolls that were previously in the display case had disappeared, and she couldn't find them anywhere in the house. Kelly hadn't left the first floor of the home while Ashley was making dinner, so she couldn't have just run off with them. She tried to shrug it off, but the weird thoughts continued to plague her mind, and rightfully so. It wasn't until later, when the duo was upstairs, that Ashley found one of the dolls hanging upside down from a painting that was way too tall for Kelly to reach in any way, and parts of another throughout Kelly's room while trying to put her to sleep. Ashley was thoroughly terrified at this point, and yeah, ditto, and when Sarah arrived home, bolted from the house as quickly as she could. The next morning, she woke up at home, in her own bed, with the last of the missing dolls next to her. She mailed it back with no return address, and refused to ever enter the Lanford home ever again.
Coming in at number 3, we have the Enfield poltergeist. Between the years of 1977 and 1979, the Enfield poltergeist terrorized a small London house in the Enfield suburb. The case involved 2 sisters, aged 11 and 13. In August 1977, single parent Peggy Hodgson called police to her home, claiming she had witnessed furniture moving and that 2 of her 4 children said that knocking sounds were heard on their walls. The children included Margaret, who was 13 at the time, and Janet, who was 11. A police officer who investigated the scene recalled seeing a chair wobble and slide but could not determine the cause of movement. Later, claims included disembodied voices, overturned chairs, and the children even levitating. Over the next year and a half, more than 30 people said that they saw heavy furniture moving on its own accord, objects being thrown around the room, and the children levitating. These people included psychic researchers, neighbours, and journalists. Creepier still, the young daughter Janet was also recorded speaking in a deep masculine voice, which was believed to be the spirit of an old man. Of course, the Warrens were called in to investigate this paranormal behaviour, which they found was a case of demonic possession. Janet later went on to admit that she had played with a Ouija board prior to the disturbances, and that she was unaware that she fell into the trances until she saw photographs later on. However, many have called the Enfield poltergeist fake, with Janet being detected in trickery with a video camera catching her bending spoons and attempting to bend an iron bar. So whatever you believe is up to you, legend or reality. Coming in at number 2, we have the Smurl family. The Smurl haunting refers to claims made by Jack and Janet Smurl, who alleged that a demon inhabited their home between 1974 and 1989. The family moved to West Pittston, Pennsylvania with their young daughters and Jack's parents, who all lived together in one house, and supposedly suffered the worst 13 years of their entire lives. Not long after moving into their new home, they claimed that the premises was disturbed by a demon that caused loud noises and bad odors. Threw their dog into a wall, shook their mattress, pushed one of their daughters down a flight of stairs, and physically and sexually assaulted Jack on several occasions. The family were terrified and called in Ed and Lorraine Warren for help. The pair quickly discovered that the family home was infested with 4 spirits: an elderly woman who was harmless, an old man who had died at the house, a young and violent girl, and a demon that controlled the other spirits and had turned them against the family. By 1987, the family decided to leave the home once and for all, and 2 years later, a church-sanctioned exorcism took place there, and the property was cleared of all paranormal activity. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have the Amityville Horror. The Amityville Horror is perhaps one of the, if not the most famous paranormal cases Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated. However, like the rest of our list, there is always debate as to how much was actually true. Some backstory to begin though. On November 13th, 1974 at 3:15 a.m, Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his parents and siblings with a rifle while they were sleeping peacefully in their beds. Around a year later, the Lutz family moved into the home on Ocean Drive. However, after just 28 days, the Lutzes left the house claiming to have been terrorized by paranormal phenomena while living there. Supposedly during their time living there, a priest was called in to bless the home, and he warned the family, do not use the upstairs room as a bedroom and do not let anyone sleep in there. Within days, things began to go wrong for the happy family. Their young daughter made an imaginary friend with a red-eyed pig. Foul odors filled each room, furniture moved and levitated, and banging would frequently be heard throughout the house at night, in turn forcing the family to flee. Enter Ed and Lorraine Warren. The pair investigated the house and soon discovered that the land the house had been built on had previously been used by a practicing black magician who had requested to be buried on the land, and he remains there to this day. A TV crew was also called in to film the investigation, with them snapping a photo that seemed to show a boy with glowing eyes. In a 2013 interview, Lorraine Warren said that the Amityville house was the one case that haunted her the most. She also went on to state during a press conference for The Conjuring, I quote, Amityville was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. It followed us straight across the country. I will never go to the Amityville house ever again. Whether you believe the story or not, something certainly spooked the Warrens enough to never return there again.
Number 5, their relationship. Now the movies portray Ed and Lorraine Warren as a perfect couple, a pair of demonologist ghost hunters that nothing could possibly stand between. No demons, no spirits, no troubles in the marriage. Well, in reality, there are claims, pretty substantial ones, that the relationship wasn't quite as picturesque as the movies made it out to be. The pair lived with a girl named Judith Penny, someone who is notably absent through the movies. Judith later in life revealed some truly shocking secrets and allegations against the pair. She suggested that Ed acted violently to Lorraine behind closed doors and claims that on more than one occasion he struck her. Penny said in a recording to The Hollywood Reporter, "Some nights I thought they might end each other's lives." Of course, the Conjuring movies are nothing like that, and portray them as a fairy tale storybook couple almost. It's a very stark contrast. The production company was strong-armed into showing the couple as loving as possible in a deal by Lorraine Warren for the films after Ed had passed away. A producer for the Conjuring films, Tony DeRosa Grund, spoke out against Ed Warren in an email to top Warner Brothers executives, referring to him as a violent husband and a criminal. He said, Lorraine enabled, she knowingly allowed an illegal relationship to continue for 40 years. They lied to the public. Now we've got lots of videos on Ed and Lorraine Warren, whether you're a fan or a hater. We've got lots on the topic. But if that's not your jam, we've got cryptids, conspiracies, true crime, fake crime, aliens, pretty much anything scary under the sun, Top 5 Scary's got a video for. So click on through, find something to scream at, and subscribe, but do that when the credits roll, okay? We worked hard on this video. Number 4, Judith Penny. Perhaps the most serious claim regarding the pair had nothing to do with ghosts or spirits, but it was the nature of the relationship with Judith Penny and Ed Warren. In 2017, evidence surfaced from Judith herself to suggest that the movies left out one of the biggest details of their lives, that Ed Warren was involved in an extramarital relationship with an underage girl. Judith has sworn that she spent 4 decades living in the Warrens' house as Ed's lover, but that the relationship began when she was 15. The claim goes on to state that the couple told people she was their niece or a poor girl that they had taken in since she had nowhere else to go. In 1963 actually, Penny was arrested and taken into custody after a concerned citizen who noticed this reported the nature of their relationship to local police. She was ordered by the court to attend a delinquent youth office for a month. Penny would tell that Ed would pick her up from school and drive her to these meetings. Now obviously these are substantial claims and serious allegations. These didn't come out until after Ed had passed, but perhaps the most concerning piece of evidence was a bizarre contract Lorraine demanded that New Line Cinema follow. This strange deal insisted that Lorraine serve as a consultant on all of the films, which makes sense, they're about her. Where it gets a bit odd is restrictions that said the films could not show the Warren characters engaging in any criminal acts, could not show Ed Warren committing any extramarital acts, or romantically involved with younger people. Very suspicious. One executive at New Line said they had never seen a deal like that before in their career. It certainly raises a very uncomfortable question: why would these things specifically be demanded not to be done?
Coming in at number 3, we've got Annabelle. If we're talking about big horror movies heavily inspired by the Warrens, it's just about impossible to ignore Annabelle. The Conjuring universe as a whole owes pretty much its entire existence to Ed and Lorraine, but their tale of Annabelle the doll is probably one of their best known. Creepy dolls work a special kind of magic, don't they? It's hard to imagine talking about cursed objects, paranormal museums, or uncanny investigations without bringing up everyone's favorite Raggedy Ann / porcelain nightmare. Tales of the two nursing students and their experience with this supposedly haunted doll have taken up a whole lot of space in modern pop culture mythology. And with the original Annabelle movie garnering enough attention to spawn 2 more movies and a whole bunch of tie-ins, they're definitely doing something right. Developing a brand new, cinematic universe-friendly story for the doll, we learn that in these flicks, Annabelle is a doll haunted by the estranged cultist daughter of a seemingly normal family. It takes a whole lot of twists and turns, and once a movie hits 2 sequels, you're bound to run into some pretty out there moments. But the OG Annabelle offers enough spooky moments and iconic doll scares to firmly cement it into the horror conversation. And of course, the famous glass case in which Annabelle is kept at the Warrens Occult Museum has a role here. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Amityville Horror. Another famous Warren case that garners a whole lot of controversy, the Amityville Horror pulls from all sorts of accounts. The main source seems to be Jay Anson's novel of the same name, which claims to be based pretty directly on the events at the Amityville house. However, there are lawsuits and claims of untruthfulness abound, so tread carefully. You probably know the story of the Lutz family by now, but here's a quick refresher. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. He said that the voices in his head made him do it, and was promptly carted off the prison. A year later, George and Kathy Lutz decided it's a good idea to move into the home where this atrocity took place. Soon after, they began experiencing some classic haunted hijinks. Their kids saw phantoms, the family dog is done away with, and for some reason, George keeps waking up at 3:15 a.m. There is something spooky going on here. You can watch 2 different versions of this one too, which makes a lot of sense considering how famous the case was. This is arguably the Ed and Lorraine Warren case. So take your pick of either the 1979 or 2005 one and have a blast. And coming in at number 1, we've got The Conjuring. And here we are with the film that launched the biggest horror franchise running. Over $1 billion and something like 8 films later, we've got quite an overview of the Warrens through horror movies. The brainchild of James Wan and Michael Blum, it took a look at the case of the Perron family and their Rhode Island farmhouse. Honestly, there's a lot of great stuff here. The original Conjuring, when it released in 2013, was a solid horror flick with some awesome scares. Who could forget the clapping game, right? Although, as the franchise chugs along, the Warrens are often portrayed in an extra dramatic light, or sometimes not at all, but when you connect all sorts of different legends together, you can afford to do that. In the movie that started it all, their roles seem pretty close to their real-life actions though. As real as you can get while portraying paranormal investigators in a fictional horror film anyways. Flicks before this one did their best with all sorts of spooky stories, but none really delved into the legend behind the creep-hunting couple themselves. I'm sure countless other horror movies have in some way been influenced by Ed and Lorraine, but it would be a little harder to prove.
Coming in at number 5, we have The Conjuring House. Upon its release in 2013, The Conjuring quickly became a fan favourite in the horror genre, with it being met with critical acclaim. The film itself follows demonologists and ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren, who head to a home in the country after a family reported demonic activity inside of their home. Now, at the time of the release, people knew very little about Ed and Lorraine Warren, or the the true events surrounding this investigation. The Perron family moved into their haunted Rhode Island home in 1971. Not long after, Carolyn, Roger, and their 5 daughters began to experience strange goings-on. Brooms going missing, scraping noises, and small piles of dirt appearing out of nowhere. All small things at first, which soon developed into big things. The girls eventually began to notice spirits around the home, with the history of the home soon being revealed. Many people had drowned in the lake, and of course the worst spirit of them all was Bathsheba, a woman who devoted herself to the devil and took her own life on the property, cursing anyone who would take her land. Ed and Lorraine Warren of course came to investigate the situation, with Lorraine conducting a seance to attempt to communicate with the spirits tormenting the family. During the seance, Carolyn became possessed, rising from the ground in her chair and speaking in tongues. Following the seance, the Warrens were kicked out of the home, with the family continuing to live there until 1980. Before we jump into number 4, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, it really helps out a lot. Coming in at number 4 we have Amityville. Back in September of 1977, Jay Anson published a book called The Amityville Horror, which would later become the basis of a series of films released from 1979 onwards. The book is claimed to be based on the paranormal experience of the Lutz family, a case which of course led to many controversies and widespread attention. Now, some history before diving into the story of the Lutz family. Back in November of 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family at 112 Ocean Avenue in the suburban neighborhood in Amityville. He was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 life sentences, with him passing away in custody in March of this year. Now, DeFeo had reported that voices had told him to kill his family. Whether these claims were true, we don't know. Jumping forward, in December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children moved into the same home, and after just 28 days they fled the house, claiming to have been terrorized by paranormal entities while living there. On the evening of March 6, 1976, the home was investigated by Ed and Lorraine Warren along with a television crew from Channel 5 New York. During the investigation, a series of pictures were taken, one of the images allegedly showing a demonic boy with glowing eyes standing at the foot of the staircase. The Warrens quite quickly suggested that the home was occupied by malevolent spirits, with the Warrens' visit to the home being depicted at the beginning of The Conjuring 2.
In 3rd place, we have the elusive White Lady of Union Graveyard. Some believe she is Harriet Seeley, whose young son passed shortly after being born, and Harriet herself passing soon afterwards. Legend believes she may have died in hopes of finding her son, and still wanders their final resting place searching him out. While others believe she is the ghost of a woman from the 1940s who killed her husband and later herself and is doomed to wander the graveyard. You tell me which one you believe. Her physical description is the one thing that remains consistent. She is a young woman wearing a white dress with dark hair. Thank goodness I'm not wearing white today. It seems as if she enjoys scaring the daylights out of the living, which, hey, my kind of gal. Many who have witnessed her believe they have almost hit her with their vehicle, only to find no trace of her once they pull over, while others claim they have often seen her hovering slightly above the ground around the cemetery, going back and forth amongst different gravestones. In 1993, local firefighter Glenn Powell received a call about a transformer explosion and drove to the scene of the incident with a police officer and observed a female driver following closely behind him on the road. He remembers the night sky had turned pink, my favorite color, and the explosion emitted large amounts of electricity that had made the hair on his arm stand up at a close distance. Glenn was driving along the road beside the cemetery when the officer seated next to him yelled, "Watch out!" In the middle of the road was a woman with, you guessed it, long brown flowing hair and wearing a white Victorian nightgown. Glenn described seeing a surprised look on her face before slamming on the brakes, but was unable to avoid hitting her, describing it like hitting a brick wall, with the back of his truck flying into the air and the policeman next to him being launched into the dashboard. The driver behind him jumped out of the car and helped the 2 men search the area of the crash to check on the woman. Glenn is quoted as saying, "There was no red bodily fluids, there was no clothing, there was nobody, there was nothing." Located in Connecticut, Lorraine used to often take walks through the cemetery, saying that it was one of the most haunted places around. Ed caught the White Lady on camera on September 1st, 1990 at 2:40 a.m., his 7th night in a row of filming at the cemetery, determined to have footage as proof, and we can show some of that footage to you now. He described dark figures surrounding her, shapes that he said were wood ghosts that seemed to jump on her while they all argued. In 2nd place, we have the Amityville Horror. On November 13th of 1974, Ronald DeFeo Sr., his wife, and 4 of their offspring, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John, had their lives ended by a firearm inside their home in suburban Amityville, New York. And at the time, homicide detectives claimed it was the largest number of victims in a single slang on Long Island. The deceased were found in their nightclothes and were shot in the back, apparently while they were asleep. There were no signs of a struggle inside the home, where a sign hanging outside the main entrance read, "High Hopes." Sure. The killings were reported by the only surviving member of the family, the oldest son, Ronald. He told the police that he arrived at the home shortly after 6 p.m. but found the front door locked, so he crawled into the house through a window and stumbled across the icky scene. He later confessed that he had ended the lives of his family around 3:30 a.m., acting out the scenes for detectives as he described how he took out his family one by one, with the weapon eventually being found in Amityville Creek. Ronald's trial began in October of 1975. His defense attorney, William Weber, tried to make a case that the defendant, who allegedly heard voices, was innocent by reason of insanity, but the court eventually sentenced him to 6 concurrent 25-year to life sentences. Try saying that 5 times fast. Eesh. A year later, the Lutz family moved into the now abandoned home, and that's where this goes from simply tragic to much, much more. Most of the DeFeo family's furniture was still in the house, because it was included for $400 as part of the deal. You know what, I'd take that deal too. A friend of George Lutz, the father of the family, had learned about the history of the house and insisted on having it blessed, and at the time, George was a non-practicing Methodist and had no experience of what this would entail. Kathy, the mom, was a non-practicing Catholic and explained the process to him. George knew a Catholic priest named Father Mancuso who agreed to carry out the house blessing. He arrived to perform the blessing while George and Kathy were unpacking their belongings on the afternoon of December 18th, 1975, and went into the home to carry out the rites. When he flicked the first amount of holy water and began to pray, he heard a masculine voice demand that he get out. When leaving the house, the priest did not mention this incident to either George or Kathy until December 24th, when he called George and advised him to stay out of the second-floor room where he had heard the mysterious voice, which happened to be the former bedroom of Mark and John DeFeo that Kathy had planned to use as a sewing room, but the call was cut short by static. Following his visit to the house, the father allegedly developed a high fever and blisters on his hands, similar to stigmata. At first, George and Kathy experienced nothing unusual in the house, but the horrors that happened over the next 28 days were awful for the Lutz family, bearing witness to slime pouring out of their walls, strange odors throughout the home, and George would wake up at 3:15 every morning, which is right around the time Ron DeFeo carried out his original crimes. A garage door would open and close on its own, an invisible spirit knocked a knife down in the kitchen, a pig-like creature with red eyes was reported staring at George and his son Daniel through a window. Also, Kathy and 2 of her children experienced bouts of levitation while trying to sleep. The footage we have from this heinous month is of a boy with glowing eyes, believed to be the spirit of the late John DeFeo. By mid-January of 1976, after another attempt at a house blessing by George and Kathy, they experienced what would be their final night in the house. Now, the Lutzes were never able to give a full account of the events that took place on this occasion, describing them as too frightening. After getting in touch with Father Mancuso, the Lutzes decided to take some belongings and stay at Kathy's mother's house in nearby Deer Park, New York, until they had sorted out the problems with the house. They claimed the phenomena followed them there, describing greenish-black slime coming up the staircase towards them. Yeah, no thanks. And finally, in first place, we have footage of an American exorcism. While the video is blurred out on YouTube to protect the identity of the poor girl, I personally think it's up there as one of the most frightening things I've ever seen. At an hour and 20 minutes long, it depicts a Catholic bishop in Connecticut attempting to converse with a demonic entity that has possessed the body of an innocent young woman, while her family restrains her. Ed and Lorraine were the ones to alert the church to the possession after meeting her during an audience chat session that was held at the conclusion of one of their public presentations. During portions of the exorcism when prayer is done, you can hear the demon acting wildly, and it originally refuses to give its name, both of which are quite common in cases of demonic possession. Eventually, we learn that there are 4 demons possessing our victim, with one of them identifying themselves as Robert, which happens to be a name associated with the son of Satan. I'll let a snippet roll now, allowing you to hear the woman for yourself.
Coming in at number 5, we have the White Lady of Easton. Located in Easton, Connecticut, Union Cemetery is a site that dates back to the 1700s, and according to ghost hunters and paranormal investigators, it is one of the most haunted cemeteries in all of the United States. Now, according to local legend, a ghost haunts Union Cemetery who has been dubbed the White Lady. She's also said to haunt Stepney Cemetery in Monroe as well. She is described as wearing a white nightgown or a wedding dress-esque outfit, with demonologist Ed Warren once claiming to have physical evidence to support these claims. Now, claims of paranormal occurrences at the cemetery had been occurring for decades prior to Ed and Lorraine Warren investigating the location. Ed Warren and several Easton police officers visited the site, which is when Ed supposedly caught the apparition on camera. Ed claimed that several ghost lights came together to form the shape of a woman who had no facial features, but had dark hair and was wearing a white dress. Terrifying. Now, there isn't a whole lot of information about the ghost or the cemetery, however, Ed and Lorraine Warren wrote a book about the location entitled Graveyard. Maybe check it out. You do you. Before we jump into number 4, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, it really helps out a lot. Coming in at number 4, we have the South End werewolf. Apparently a lot of demonic activity occurs in Essex, with this being one of 2 to appear on our list. Born and raised in Southend in Essex in the United Kingdom, Bill Ramsey began to experience trouble at the young age of 9 years old. He was outside one day when he began to feel a little strange. An icy blast swept over him and a foul stench appeared, causing him to almost vomit. Anger began to take hold and the young boy uprooted a fence post, swinging it around like a club with the fence still attached. It was stated that not even his parents were able to remove the post with their hands. Bill Ramsey then placed the wire meshing of the fence into his mouth and began to chew on it, terrifying his parents in the process, who supposedly ran into their home for safety. Following the incident, things settled, with nothing occurring for 15 years. Bill Ramsey grew up, got married and became a father of 3. However, during this time he was plagued by nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat and feeling dread and unease. Once again, another 15 years passed with no repeated occurrences of what happened when he was a young boy. That was until 1983, when Bill was out at a pub with a few of his friends. After having a few drinks, he began to feel that same chill he experienced when he was young. He went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and looking back at him was a werewolf. He hopped in a car with a few friends heading home. However, he began to growl with his hands twisting into claws and proceeded to try to bite his friend's leg. After a handful of incidents that would follow this one, Bill was taken to a psychiatric hospital, with doctors being unable to explain his condition. Bill ultimately traveled to the States to meet Ed and Lorraine Warren, where a priest performed an exorcism on Bill, which supposedly cured him. But not before he partially transformed into a werewolf in front of witnesses.
Number 3, the Warrens' psychic photography. Although admittedly not a single case but an exhibition of quite a large number, a technique that was woven by the Warrens throughout their career as paranormal investigators. Now take this with a pinch of salt, because for those that oppose the Warrens' claims, the majority of criticism comes from their specific technique of paranormal photography. The vast majority of the Warrens' physical evidence comes from photography, racking up hundreds of ghost snaps that form the basis of their alleged paranormal evidence, which must fit 2 specific instructions for it to make the grade. Use an autofocused or fixed focus camera with an automatic flash, and the more power the flash, the better. Supposedly, the more exposition of light, the more successful it will be to catch ghosts, specifically under Lorraine's technique, which pinpoints energy vortices and allows a spirit to manifest itself. They used this technique for the entirety of their career and it never seemed to change, but for me it is probably the weakest part of their casework and has the most holes when it comes to credibility. What do you guys think? Swinging in at our number 2 spot, Union Cemetery. According to local legend, the Union Cemetery in eastern Connecticut dates as far back as the 1700s and is infamous as one of the most haunted cemeteries in the United States. Luckily for them then, that Ed and Lorraine Warren lived pretty much next door to this hotspot hive of haunted activity. Very lucky. One of the most notorious ghosts in the graveyard is the White Lady, also known as the Lady in White, a spirit tortured by the tragedy of her mortal life. In some legends, the victim of betrayal by her husband, in other cases, murdered by her illicit boyfriend. Well, luckily for us, Ed Warren claimed to have captured footage of the White Lady on camera. He first recorded the White Lady on September 1st, 1990 at around 2:40 AM when he heard a woman weeping beyond the gravestones, looked out and saw hundreds of strange lights floating around, which manifested into the figure of a young woman dressed in white with long, dark hair. He screwed up when he walked towards the figure though, and the ghost disappeared. According to Ed's advice, you never walk towards the ghost, you let the ghost come towards you, because a human can change the molecular and magnetic field when a ghost is materializing. Useful. Well, sounds like crazy footage, right? Something to catch on camera. Well, unfortunately for us, Ed Warren refused to show evidence of this particular video, instead hoarding it for himself, despite urges for it to be analysed by the scientific community. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the Snedeker House. This one is pretty messed up even when you remove the paranormal element. Otherwise known as a haunting in Connecticut, which went on to inspire the Hollywood film of the same name, although Ed and Lorraine reportedly detested the film for its historical inaccuracy, claiming that so much more happened than what the film depicted. According to them, the real story involved the Snedeker family, who purchased their family home at a knockout price due to it serving previously as, wait for it, a funeral home and mortuary. Yeah, you're kind of just asking for it there really. Not only that, but there was also a graveyard outside. Take the hint. If you take local legend into account, the house was home to some pretty vile deeds where staff at the funeral home were rumoured to have been caught in acts of necrophilia, leading to an infestation of malevolent spirits. As events unfolded, the Snedeker family were terrorised by demonic occurrences, tap water running with blood, children being mysteriously spun around by invisible forces, and the family waking up to toe tags attached to them like that of a corpse. Now, this case has been hotly disputed, and the Warrens were famously criticised for their involvement with the Snedeker family, who were reportedly involved in some serious drug and alcohol abuse, which formed the basis of their paranormal claims rather than actually being terrorised by a demonic spirit. Nevertheless, Ed and Lorraine stood by their involvement as one of the most terrifyingly paranormal occurrences throughout their entire career, and Lorraine maintains this stance long after Ed Warren's passing.
Coming in at number 5, we've got the Smurl haunting. Technically, there already is a movie about the Smurl haunting, titled The Haunted, and released as a made-for-TV movie back in 1991. Folks with cable television were treated to a horrifying vision of demonic possession in Pennsylvania. However, we live in the golden age of streaming, with brand new top-notch movies and shows being released almost daily. So with the advances in filmmaking technology and maybe some assistance from the research team at Blumhouse, I think this tale could be brought back to life in incredible fashion. Based on what's happened with the mainline Conjuring series lately, it would be interesting to see a return to a strictly haunted house format, but the story here is rich enough to make it work. Here's the real-life story of the Smurls. Hopefully you'll see how it works as a movie. In the mid-70s, Janet and Jack Smurl were forced out of their home due to flood damage. They packed up their stuff, got their kids and parents in a car, and moved down to West Pittston. For a while, they focused their energy on fixing the place up. Some painting needed to be done and old appliances need to be replaced. Other than that though, all seemed well. This was short-lived, however. Soon, weird things started happening. Tools would disappear without a trace or end up in places far away from where they should be. Stains would seep through brand new coats of paint no matter how thick it was laid on. Kitchen appliances would catch fire even if they weren't plugged in at the time. And of course, terrible smells permeated throughout but would disappear quickly once noticed. Pretty standard haunted stuff if you ask me. But that was just the beginning, as even more noticeable ghastly behavior began. The kids heard disembodied voices that pretended to be their siblings, and Janet insisted that she heard her mother-in-law calling out to her. Dark shapes would float around the house, and one night, one seemed to crawl into bed with the Smurls. Needless to say, they were pretty freaked out. Things hit a fever pitch when the family dog was thrown up against the wall, and Janet was picked up and dangled 3 feet in the air. At that point, it was time to bring in some help. The Warrens arrived and soon found out that there were 3 human spirits in the house, accompanied by a malevolent demon. 2 of the spirits were harmless and the 3rd one was potentially violent, but the demon was the real problem. It made the other spirits do awful things and intensified the haunting plenty. You can see how this would make for an excellent horror movie, right? We meet the Smurls as they're moving in. Things are hunky-dory. However, the kids notice some strange stuff at night and mom and dad are wondering why their renovations aren't holding up. Then something changes and it is full-on haunt mode. Ed and Lorraine show up and the mystery begins to unravel. Tie it in with the other Conjuring flicks and you've got yourself a summer horror blockbuster. Blumhouse, call me. Coming in at number 4, we've got Lindley Street. Here we have another famous haunted house which would perfectly align with the rest of the series had they not switched it up for The Devil Made Me Do It. I'm sure a return to form would go over just fine though. Moving on from my goofy format-based nitpicking, here's a good story. Haunted houses tend to get folks interested in anything, so that's a good start. Also happening in the mid-70s at the time, this was a well-publicized poltergeist. Connecticut is famous for all sorts of haunted and damned locations, but Lindley Street is probably one of the most famous. Gerard and Laura Goodwin, homeowners in Good Samaritans, reported an array of otherworldly attacks in their little bungalow. Windows were broken, furniture was scattered, a cat inexplicably spoke in English, and more. The longer this went on, the more folks became interested. For a while, all sorts of folks that weren't the Goodwins saw these paranormal occurrences too. That's what made this such a high-profile haunting. All sorts of reputable and reliable community members claiming to see insane, seemingly impossible things happening in their peaceful neighborhood. News teams, nosy neighbors, firefighters, police squads, priests, and of course the Warrens were called in to see what they could do. And then, just like the neighbors, the policemen and firefighters saw the paranormal experiences happening. So there are a few ways we could approach this tale of terror in a cinematic fashion. There's the obvious way, which is fitting the events into the Conjuring universe and having all sorts of new characters introduced that could have witnessed the haunting. Classic, can't miss stuff right there. However, the guy in me who took a bunch of film courses at university makes me want to look at this a little differently. You know, I want to hear all sorts of different perspectives, a bit of he said, she said, maybe investigate what each individual saw and see if there is an ultimate answer. If I'm being too vague, I'll come right out and say it. Let's make a haunted house Rashomon. Like, have the Warrens or some surrogate demonologists come in at the very beginning and ask folks what's happening. Then you get accounts from each invested party, and every tale is different in some way or another. And then, as is the case with most real-life haunted houses, we don't really come away with a concrete answer. Just the tales of those who experienced it themselves and the tricky job of putting the pieces together ourselves. Think about it.
And at number 3, the effects of seeing a ghost. This 7-minute video features Ed and Lorraine Warren alongside a guest of theirs named Rod. Rod had seen multiple ghosts and has a discussion with the paranormal experts about the aftermath of seeing a ghost and how it affects one's life. He goes on to explain the intense sorrow that he felt after seeing the ghost, which just so happened to be the White Lady of Union Graveyard. He experienced night terrors, was extremely upset, and had excessive tremors for months, reoccurring whenever he was reminded of the event. Ed goes on to explain that the sadness that Rod felt is something called radiotelethesis, which happens when a human picks up on the emotions of a spirit when they have a close physical encounter. The fact that something like this could occur to any individual is pretty darn creepy.
A good friend of mine had died, and a couple nights after that, sitting in my bedroom, I saw the figure of a woman in front of my windows. So my bed was on this end of the room and my windows were there. And from the light coming in, I could see a woman sitting looking out my bedroom window, and where the window ended, that's where the figure ended.
And at number 2, the Borley Rectory. The Borley Rectory is said to be one of the most haunted places in the UK. A nun had been buried within the walls of its church, and once found was moved to a nearby graveyard. But ever since, there's been some serious haunting. According to this video though, Ed and Lorraine have been to that location over 200 times. Talk about courage. The duo discussed their first experience at Borley Church in 1976, with Lorraine saying that the investigator that she was with, who was very skeptical to begin with, was assaulted by a spirit, claiming he could not breathe, and that something was pushing him. Later on, they listened back to the audio that they were recording while they were there. Lorraine said that you could hear a woman's voice over his screaming, saying the words, "Hit him, hit him." And finally, in at number 1, poltergeists. In this clip from a documentary, Ed and Lorraine talk about poltergeists and their dangers. It features a clip of them that they recorded with a family in Connecticut dealing with a poltergeist, with the family's face blurred out in order to give them privacy. It starts off with the group saying prayers, and then Ed tries to communicate with the spirit. We hear the spirit making banging noises in response. Ed proceeds to ask the spirit who it doesn't like, listing off each individual in the family. It finally answers yes via the knocking to the family's mother. Then Ed confronts the poltergeist on his own, and we see chairs and furniture moving around the room. The video continues, showing a clip of the family's little girl being bothered by the poltergeist, who moves the chair that she's sitting on. The Warrens would then later call a priest to perform an exorcism, which wasn't on camera. Arguably, you can see why. Although by the end of the clip, the two of them note that there's no way of knowing if a poltergeist may or may not come back to haunt the family.
In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to reveal your identity.
Starting us off in at number 5, Annabelle. Here we have a clip of Lorraine Warren that's fairly recent, talking about the real-life Annabelle doll. Doll, which was given to a college student by her mother as a gift, turned out to be a doll that was manipulated by a demon in an attempt to possess her or her roommate. The events surrounding the doll and why Ed and Lorraine were brought in are eerie at best. It began with the doll moving around the house on its own, and even resulted in one of their friends being brutally attacked by it, with the doll strangling him. Here's what Lorraine had to say about it when the second film inspired by the doll, Annabelle Creation, came out.
Evil needs a body to go into, and if you're vulnerable, it's going to be you.
And at number 4, Amityville. Here we have a recording of Ed and Lorraine retelling their experience with the famous Amityville house in Long Island. Now at the time when they were called, they didn't realize that the house had been the location of 6 previous murders. Here's Ed describing what they experienced when they first got there.
We went into the house that day. We didn't realize that it was diabolically infested. He went to that shrine and he brought back from there a priest, an exorcist, who said masses in the house. Why? If this was a hoax that was created by the Lutz family, Why 6 months before this man was murdered and his family was an exorcist in that house?
Eerie stuff. The Amityville horror case has long been criticized as being a hoax perpetuated by the Lutz family. But from what the Warrens claim, it was a sinister place long before the family had the unfortunate luck of moving in there. Up next at 3, the haunting in Connecticut. This particular case is concerned with a haunted funeral home, and it happened in 1988. The couple had gotten a call from the homeowners saying that they were being tormented by ghosts, to the point where the assaults were even sexual in nature. Now, the house had been converted from a funeral home to a regular house before they had bought it. Believing that necrophilia had occurred there in the past, the Warrens had this to say about what they discovered there.
The instruments they used for embalming, the embalming table, the chain hoist, everything was still there. But there was lumber all over. There was also what they called the sales coffin room, where they put the caskets.
And at number 2, the White Lady of Union Cemetery. In East Connecticut, there's a spirit that Ed and Lorraine had made various attempts to capture via psychic photography. According to Ed, people had claimed to see a lady in white walking around the cemetery, so the couple investigated it. Ed stayed in the graveyard for 7 nights, leaving his home around midnight each night, and waited with his camera. He tells of how on September 1st at 2:40 a.m., he saw the White Lady. Here's what he had to say about it.
I'm sitting there and I could see all these lights over near the Baptist cemetery, all around the stone wall, and all these thousands and millions of insects were just chirping away. All of a sudden things started to quiet down, and I could hear what sounded like a woman weeping. I took the camera out and I could see all these ghost lights suddenly forming into a figure. Out of a woman.
He goes on to say that he wasn't able to see her through his camera, but only with the naked eye. He put his camera on his tripod and let it run, and tried to walk towards her, but she disappeared. So he backed away, and that's when she reappeared. He then saw some shadow ghosts holding her back from him. He claims that a shadow ghost then pushed her towards the road, and then she was gone. And finally, in our number 1 spot, Bill. The Enfield poltergeist is one of the Warrens' most publicized cases. It was the topic for the Conjuring 2 film, in which we saw the Warrens, played by Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, attempt to help the family rid themselves of spirits who were severely haunting them in the late 70s. The film actually used the audio recordings that the duo recorded while at the house as inspiration. Take a listen. As you can hear, the demon's voice is audible talking to Ed. The demon was possessing one of the 4 children, a girl named Janet, and the voice was said to have been called Bill. This is by far the most famous audio recording of the Warrens. And number 5, Guided by a Priest. In this video feature, published by YouTube channel Gravity Media Productions, we see a film crew brought down into the occult museum by a priest who guides them on their tour. We get a glimpse of the Annabelle doll and the Warrens' satanic idol that was found in the early 90s in the woods of Newtown. The priest shows the crew the shadow doll and tells them the horrific story of how the doll entered a couple's nightmares collectively. He also shows the crew children's tombstones that were used as altars for satanic rituals. It's then followed up by a clip of Lorraine Warren saying how she refuses to go back down into the occult museum, especially now that she's lost Ed. It's just too risky for her. And at number 4, Mocking Annabelle. During an interview, Ed Warren tells a camera crew a chilling story about an instance that happened at the museum. One day, a young man and his girlfriend drove his motorcycle over to the occult museum and took a look inside. While in front of the Annabelle doll, he began to mock it, not believing that a demon truly possessed it. He challenged it to do something evil, all while tapping on the glass case that the doll is held within. Later on, as he drove away with his girlfriend, having a laugh over Annabelle and the other objects they had seen, the couple got into a tragic accident that ended his life and severely paralyzed his girlfriend. While it seems that perhaps it may have been Annabelle who was responsible for this, or at least that's what Ed Warren seems to believe.
The young man came here, felt it was nothing but a joke, started knocking on the glass, saying if this thing could perform any kind of evil act, to do it. 3 hours later, the young man was dead. He came here on a motorcycle with his girlfriend. She said they were laughing about the doll when they left. She was paralyzed in a hospital for over a year.
It could be that something else in the museum cursed them after hearing the mocking, since Annabelle is said to be extremely secure in the case that she's currently held within.
Number 3. The Stalker. Michael Melanson is a former Marine and foster parent living in a small community in California called Kings Canyon. While checking his Snapchat messages, Melanson noticed something unsettling. Among these usual snaps was one that stood out from an unrecognized username. Intrigued, Melanson opened the snaps unsure what to expect. What he saw made this fully trained Marine chill. The message was a picture of Melanson with an unnerving caption saying, "See you soon." More pictures would get sent showing places on Melanson's daily routine. His gym, his favorite coffee shop, a close-up picture of the street sign where he lived. I would probably block that guy and actually chuck my phone into the river. I think that guy from 2 points ago had the right idea. But Melanson reached out to the authorities. It seemed like the Marine had a stalker. The police had advised him to save and document all of the messages as evidence, and they launched an investigation, although little came of it. Surprise, surprise. The snaps continued and grew more invasive. More photos of the neighborhood and frequent hotspots. It reached its peak when one of the photos was that of Michael inside his own home. Michael then fitted his house with security cameras and confided with friends about what was happening. He became hyper aware of his surroundings, constantly pinging and scanning for any threats. The stalker seemed to have calmed down and the messages were dwindling out. Was it over? If only. Eventually, the police were able to track the IP to a location nearby. The subject was a disturbed individual with a fascination with Melanson, a young man by the name of Riley Poeta, who worked at the bowling alley Melanson lived below and frequented and did most of his business in. He was taken in. The story is a modern-day horror movie plot, a reminder that not everyone in your neighborhood is as friendly as you might want them to be, and with the right information, anyone can get a hold of you. Truly spine-chilling stuff. Number 2. Thomas Sparks. Thomas Sparks was an amateur athlete who used his Snapchat mostly to highlight his athletics and daily vlogs about his life. A gymnast trying to attain as many world records as he could, and he might have broken the record for most haunted Snapchat story out there. Dubious one. Listen to the story he posted to Reddit. One day while browsing the app, Sparks uncovered a filter he hadn't seen advertised anywhere, which allegedly would show supernatural entities on camera. A joke, obviously, just meant for fun. Sounds fun. Sparks uploaded a few videos showing off the filter, thinking it nothing more than a game. But as the days went on, Sparks noticed that even when he wasn't using his phone at all, he would occasionally catch glimpses of ghostly figures in his vision, vanishing when he tried to meet them head on. Sparks attributed it to working out maybe a little bit too hard and not getting enough rest and not drinking enough water. Stay hydrated. If you learn anything from Top 5 Scary, stay hydrated. Sparks said that after about a week after installing the filter, he began hearing faint whispers when he was alone in his bedroom, and even reported that some objects seemingly were moving on their own. A lamp moved across his bedroom, things not being where he'd left it. Sparks was growing incredibly paranoid, I think as most of us would be if we invited a ghost into our home. Thomas contacted Snapchat support, but unsurprisingly, they didn't have much to offer for him, instead only giving a generic message stating that the filter is just a playful feature and the company doesn't take any responsibility for any paranormal hauntings that could occur as a side effect. Well, they probably didn't say that, but hey, have you ever read all of Snapchat's terms and conditions? That might be in there. Nobody's gonna sit down and read all that. They might have something about ghosts. Out of ideas, Sparks deleted the app from his phone and claimed that he'd stopped experiencing any of the paranormal activity that was bugging him before, and has since not used the app whatsoever. What do you think, gang? Was Sparks telling the truth? Did he unintentionally become a conduit for spiritual activity? Or is he taking home a gold medal for creative storytelling? You tell us. Also, shout out to this guy just deleting the app. Everybody else went through all this like hullabaloo, but he was the only guy who just figured out like, oh yeah, I'll just get rid of this. Seems way easier than anything else. And finally, number 1. Snapchat stories can be a very mixed bag. There's good odds most of what you'll see is just sponsored junk, ads for IGN, models doing their thing, you know. But every now and then you come across something that catches your eye and hooks you in. Maybe too far. That's what happened to James Brett Varney, an educator from Moncton, New Brunswick. Varney reportedly, while scrolling through stories, clicked on one from a profile he hadn't heard of called Unknown Realms. The story in question was a series of random, quickly edited, unsettling videos. Cryptic symbols, unintelligible writing and sounds, and quick flashes of people in dark robes surrounded by candles and ominous objects looking like a deleted scene out of Eyes Wide Shut. Varney was naturally unnerved by what he had seen, but brushed it off, assuming it was probably just, you know, promo for some sleeper indie horror A24 hit that your friends are all gonna say is really good, but you're never actually gonna watch. As time went on though, Varney found himself thinking more and more about the flashing images, saying that it felt like it was a dream replaying in his head over and over, and it was bothering him infinitely more than some stupid little Snapchat story should. He kept coming back to it to watch it over and over again to see if there was anything he missed. He said he felt like it was an invitation to some cult. He researched Unknown Realms for a bit, but wasn't finding anything to attach it. No project, no movie, no video game. James went to report the story to the authorities to see if they'd help him, but found that when he did, the video had been scrubbed from the app. Confused, James went on to research more into the phenomena and found others online who claimed to have all seen the same mysterious story. No one was able to get to the bottom of it. Recruitment tool for a clandestine organization? Art project by some bored art majors? We might never know. A reminder that there is so much hiding on the boundless wild west of cyberspace we may never get the answers to. And you know what? That's not such a bad thing. Sometimes some stories are better left untold, some snaps better left unopened.
Coming in at number 5, Union Cemetery. Union Cemetery is located near Stepney Road in eastern Connecticut. The site dates back to the 1700s, and according to ghost hunters, it is one of the most haunted cemeteries in the entire United States. Now, as you'd expect, Ed and Lorraine Warren were quick to involve themselves in the mystery surrounding the cemetery, with the pair even writing a book about the site entitled Graveyard. According to popular legends, the White Lady ghost haunts Union Cemetery as well as Stepney Cemetery in Monroe. The White Lady has been seen walking in front of people's cars as they drive along Route 59, late at night. Concerned drivers believed that they had hit a person, exit their vehicles only to discover there was no one there. The White Lady name comes from witnesses who states that she wore either a white gown or what appeared to be a wedding dress. Now in 1990, Ed and Lorraine Warren set up cameras in the cemetery to record the investigation. Around 2:40 a.m. they heard the sound of a woman weeping, and a female form had begun to move several feet in their direction. As Ed began to approach her, she vanished from sight. Nowadays, the cemetery is known to close after sunset. Coming in at number 4, we have the werewolf in London. Bill Ramsey from Southend-on-Sea in England was considered living proof that werewolves actually exist. Now, the first inkling of trouble for Bill came when he was just 9 years old. One day he was outside in his garden playing when he began to feel strange. An icy blast swept all over him, perspiration froze on his skin, and a foul stench made him need to vomit. Then, out of nowhere, anger and rage took over, and young Bill uprooted a fence post, with the fence still attached, and began swinging it around like a club. Should be noted that not even his parents could remove that fence post. Now, all returned to normal for a while. Ramsey grew up, became a loving husband and father of 3, and was instant-free up until the 1960s. During this time, he began to be plagued by nightmares, cold sweats, and waking up panting like a wild animal. Not long after, he began to feel the same sensations he had that day in the garden when he was 9, and on one occasion he attacked a friend in a car on their way from a pub and manhandled police on several occasions. In turn, Ramsey was forced to spend time in the hospital, where it was noted that he exhibited inhuman strength, growling, and his hands would often curl like claws. Ed and Lorraine Warren were thus called in to investigate. Ed Warren stated that, I quote, Ramsey would ask to be locked up in jail cell for his protection and the protection of the public. The Warrens then invited Ramsey to their Connecticut home, where Bishop Robert McKenna would perform a recorded exorcism on Ramsey.
Number 3, swatting. Now, for those of us who aren't on the internet as much, maybe you aren't super familiar with this term swatting. It has nothing to do with flies, but instead refers to the practice of obtaining a victim's IP address and then anonymously or falsely reporting serious criminal activity at the location, such as a bomb threat, hostage situation, or any other number of things that would necessitate the boys in blue packing up, getting in the van, and kicking down your door. The SWAT team shows up, kicks the front door down, ready to go, and tragically, more often than not, it ends poorly. And it happens to be a huge trend. It's even happened to celebrities like Justin Bieber and Rihanna. One of the biggest targets is gamers and streamers getting locked in vicious rivalries. Well, like many other illegal services, swatting is allegedly something you can buy through the dark web. Worried about the consequences? Don't want to spend money on an expensive trial for going to jail? Well, apparently you can hire someone to SWAT for you. One alleged website offers tiers of service ranging from mild situations to a little worse. They'll bring many people and raid them, all the way to the lofty, the SWAT team comes and from there they'll do anything. Now, despite huge sentences for swatting, up to 25 years to life by the way, in case you're wondering, it's still a fairly common occurrence. Disposable phones, encrypted phone numbers, and even Skype have all been tools for the would-be swatter. As such, Various law enforcement agencies across the United States have been trying to crack down on the practice as much as they can in order to dispel any would-be swatters from getting any bright ideas and to dispel any more tragedies from occurring. Number 2, bed bugs. This one is really out there, but I'm gonna be honest, it's the ones that are really out there that are the ones I'm most interested in, of course. I want to bring you the stuff you probably haven't seen in any other top 5 videos, and this was too good to pass up. On a Reddit thread asking, plainly, what's your dark web story? We had this from user UrbanHawk1, who said that in his time on the dark web, he saw all manner of nefarious business, but none that truly stuck out to him more, none that was stranger than one man who was trying to acquire a massive amount of bed bugs shipped to his home. Naturally, people on the marketplace website were a bit curious. Other users on the unknown website wanted to know why exactly you'd invite that sort of thing into your home. Most of us want that out. Well, the bug collector was looking to, and paraphrasing the original Redditor's words, he wanted to try to breed bed bugs to be resistant to all the usual manner of extermination, while simultaneously breeding in a weakness that would remain secret to only him. From here, he would then unleash his genetically superior bed bugs onto the unsuspecting population, who would then have to pay him to have it dealt with, since he was the only one who knew their weakness. Now, if this one is sounding just a tiny bit comic booky to you, that's because similar schemes were also the plot of the villains of the Amazing Spider-Man movie and the Michael Bay Ninja Turtles. Now, unfortunately, there's no follow-up to this. I couldn't really find a second source on this anywhere, and Urban Hawk's story is the only time I ever saw this particular anecdote mentioned, but it was too interesting to pass up. You have to wonder, maybe Urban Hawk, the guy who posted about it, maybe he was the bedbug mastermind looking to see if there was any interest in the business. We may never know, but I'm definitely feeling itchy just talking about it. And number 1, we see you. Our next story comes to us from a Reddit user going by the handle FakeFakington. So, all that being said, maybe just take whatever he says with a grain of salt if that's how he chooses to advertise. Making matters more confusing, he does list his real name on his Reddit account as Truth Realtime, so who's to say? Now, TruthFakington, Fake Truth, he recounts the story of the early days of the dark web, when everything was still very deep and dark. Back in the day, Fakey Truthy was browsing random links, just like us kids today still do. He describes a lot of it as not particularly interesting, until he found sort of an early blog, describing random thoughts, musings, and so on. But he said they felt a bit like someone was trying to pass secret notes to each other. So, curious, he wanted to know more about what he was reading, and he compiled the IPs from the various messages and writings to try and get a better understanding about what he had found. Now, he said he made his way through a digital rabbit hole to find himself in a collection of medical records, the sort of thing that a psychologist or a therapist might keep, perhaps. The images were mostly of faxes and predominantly medical, but also military in nature too. As he was browsing through all of the files he had just uncovered, he noticed a new one had uploaded as he was browsing through them. The timestamp on the upload listing the exact minute he was browsing. The message was named, spine-chillingly, "Hello there. Infinitely braver than I would be." Mr. Fake Truthington opened up the file and saw that it was nothing but plain text that read out, "We see you." And about 15 seconds later, the server dropped altogether. Now, Fake Fakington is still around today. He's still an avid Redditor and tech head and was able to bring us this story, but no doubt that one little incident probably kept him awake for a few nights and probably kept him away from the dark web for a bit. I know I would.
Coming in at number 5, we've got The Haunted. Before the Amityville Horror, before The Haunting in Connecticut, and definitely way back before The Conjuring, there was a horror movie focused on a Warren case without the backing of any Hollywood studios. There was a horror movie focused on a Warren case that wouldn't make it to theaters. That's right, a made-for-TV movie featuring all the haunts and scares you'd expect. Based on a book of that same title, it takes a look at one of the lesser-known Warren investigations. The Haunted aired first in 1991 and took a swing at dramatizing the Smurl haunting. Jack and Janet Smurl claimed that a demon inhabited their Pennsylvania home for more than a decade, leading to them seeking the help of the Warrens. This demon caused them all sorts of pain and suffering, from generating loud noises and bad smells to pushing people down the stairs. Apparently it even threw their dog at the wall one time. After all these horrific events, they reached out to Ed and Lorraine. The couple came to town and performed a series of tests to see what could be done about the demon. They attempted to play religious music and pray, but this just caused the demon to amp up its performance. Ed reported that mirrors would shake and often the temperature would severely drop. Dark masses were sighted, and at one point they even got a message written on a mirror, demanding that they get out. All in all, a pretty classic haunting. And while The Haunted doesn't connect with the Conjuring universe, it's still a pretty decent little horror movie. In fact, it even garnered Sally Kirkland a Golden Globe nomination for her performance as Janet Smurl. So if you're looking for a little bit of a throwback and are interested in one of the earlier depictions of the Warrens on the big, or in this case, small screen, here you go, The Haunted. Coming in at number 4, we've got The Haunting in Connecticut. This one is particularly interesting as there's some controversy surrounding its claim to have been based on a true story. So the movie is supposed to be based on the experiences of Carmen Snedeker and her family. They moved into an old house that was once a funeral home, which usually results in some spooky stuff happening, right? This decision to move into a creepy place was influenced by the fact that their son was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and wanted to be closer to the hospital. After settling into the abode, they started finding evidence that the home was once full of dead bodies. Embalming tables, mortician's tools, and more were discovered, tipping them off to the previous purpose of the place. These details led a lot of people to not believe the tale from the get-go, but if you take the family's need for hospital proximity into account, maybe it makes a little more sense. Then started all the paranormal happenings, from objects moving when nobody was looking to the kids seeing strangers wandering around the house. A few months of this, and the Snedeker family reached out to the Warrens. With their arrival on the premises, things got a little clearer. Ed and Lorraine moved into the haunted home and discovered some new things about it. Apparently the morticians who lived there practiced necromancy, which ended up imbuing the house with a terrible curse. This explained the unexplainable events and gave a rationale for what was happening. They then performed an exorcism and claimed that the house was safe for the family to inhabit. Many folks connected to the Warrens and this story say that a lot that happened was exaggerated, which tends to be the case with a lot of paranormal investigations. A lot of it is up to interpretation, and the true story angle to this movie is especially dubious thanks to how they handled it. See, the Warrens don't make an official appearance in the movie, and a lot of the discoveries are made by other people. And in the end, the narrative chose not to do an exorcism to cleanse the home, but use a purifying fire to drive the spirits out instead. So while The Haunting in Connecticut is definitely inspired by a real-life Warren case and pulls a lot of elements from it, the facts are played pretty fast and loose. What can you expect though, right?
In third place, we have the case of purple scrubs. Former EMT David O'Keefe worked mainly in transfers, and this particular client was always his last one of the day, having to return home late at night in the dark. She was an older woman who visited the hospital he was based out of for regular dialysis treatment. One specific day, she was being moved, and David was sitting in the back of the transport vehicle with her. She looked under the weather, so he asked what was wrong out of concern, and she said a man in purple had been visiting her. He asked if the man was, like a relative or a technician, but she shook her head. She said the man would sit next to her during dialysis appointments and stroke her hair. Thinking this was strange, right after he dropped her off at the hospital, David asked the hospital techs about, such a person, but no one had seen or remembered anyone wearing purple. Visitors also weren't really a thing at this part of the hospital, so he assumed the patient was just imagining it. While he was waiting to bring her back home, he saw the man in purple scrubs waiting outside that woman's room, watching her door. As David went to approach him, a bunch of tech personnel urgently ran past them into the woman's room, and David lost sight of the man. It turned out the woman in the room had suffered a heart attack and was sadly unable to be revived. Oh, and just a tiny creepy footnote, none of the staff in that hospital wore purple scrubs. In second place, we have a mystery mimic. Yeah, I'm fond of alliteration. How can you tell? This spooky story comes to us courtesy of former late night transportation worker Betty. She worked the position for a few years, but after this incident, did everything possible to never work a nighttime shift ever again. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all laundry was done and all supplies were sorted and housed. On this particular night, Betty was the only one in the basement when she heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator and poked her head around the corner expecting to see her only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. And so, she shrugged it off. That night in particular was slower in pace, so she opted to take a snack break and veg in the break room for a bed, when she heard a loud bang out of nowhere. Betty walked into the hallway and a bed was rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides of the walls. Now at this point, she assumed that her coworker was playing a prank on her, and she directly radioed him to chew him out, but he swore he was upstairs. Honestly, I'd be assuming the same. I've had a similar situation in a haunted house I used to work in at an old theater, but Betty was smart about it and determined to catch her coworker in the act. She started walking down the hallway, and as she passed the laundry room, all the machines started up. She poked her head in, expecting to find him, but the room was completely empty. Just a tiny worrisome spooky flag. Nothing to worry about, right? As she walked into the laundry room, the machines came to a complete stop. Betty froze at first before regaining her senses and making her way towards the elevator, when she heard whistling from the other end of the hall. Now at this point, she's certain that she's the only worker in the basement and is repeatedly pressing the elevator buttons in an attempt to rush it. As she was waiting for the elevator, things started falling off the shelves down the hall. Betty could only stare in shock as boxes of gloves, tissues, and packages of tubes fell off various racks one by one. Her entire body broke out in goosebumps, every hair standing on its end, and the feeling of being watched had completely consumed her thoughts. When the elevator finally arrived after what seemed like forever, Betty felt the sensation of someone brushing her arm and screamed in panic. Upon exiting the elevator upstairs, she made a beeline for the cafeteria, where her coworker actually was, and broke down explaining the entire ordeal. Now, before y'all ask, but Alexa, how was this spirit a mimic? Turns out that Betty usually whistles to herself at work at night, chats with the laundry folks during daytime shifts, and the items that fell off the shelf slowly were common items that she would have to retrieve. Big note for me on this one. In first place, we have terrified security staff. Security guard Mason claims that while he wants his location to stay anonymous, he used to work overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the USA. He and his fellow security officers all have stories about one building in particular, which was built in the late 1800s and was the original psychiatric building for this hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders at that time. On top of that, this hospital was known for its medical research. Sadly, with what we all know about history, when you combine the two, that spells out a lot of nightmares. A couple years before Mason started working security there, this building in particular had been converted partially into offices after the newly built part of the hospital had dedicated a section for the updated psych ward. Mason's rounds for the first night of our tale happened to include, yep, you guessed it, that building. At night, this building was empty, due to most of the staff who worked in those offices leaving by 5 p.m. every day. Apparently some folks like to rush home, which is fair, but they would leave their office doors unlocked, which was a big no-no, due to medical information being located in their offices. Big confidential stuff. Kinda want to keep that locked up. It was security's job to go to each floor, make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it themselves. Mason did his initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear of people, and then proceeded to do door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so he could check both sides of the hallway's doors at once. At the end of this hallway, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end, so you had to come back out, go the other way. He noticed everything was secure, so he was ready to move on to the next floor. He exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead end office and froze at what he saw. Every door that he had already checked was completely ajar and set so perfectly so that their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again. A single wheelchair had appeared at the end of the hallway and was facing towards the steps. Mason had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to the strange stuff that was happening, but he originally laughed it off until that night. He went around and forced the now open door shut and tried to shrug it off. Nothing else weird happened that night, and he returned the next night to patrol the miners' ward. The area was just under construction, so security was needed to make sure nobody got hurt by accident and all the workers were doing their job. Safety first. When Mason was hanging out in the break room before his shift officially started, other security guards were discussing various reports of seeing a young human with brown hair who would disappear randomly, and Mason dismissed this as just gossip meant to spook off the newbies. An hour into making his rounds, a foreman who had stayed late called security and asked for a security officer to come up because, quote, a youngin' with brown hair had locked himself in a room and he didn't want him to get hurt with all the open wires in there. Mason answered the call, went and unlocked the door for the foreman, and looked in a 20x8 room for about 10 minutes, and upon seeing no one, called it in as a false alarm. He attempted to shrug it off until he received a call for backup in the psych ward, and when he arrived he noticed a patient was in a state of panic near the remnants of a shattered chandelier. Now, before he had experienced the abnormal happenings in this building, Mason claims he would have written off his testimony as idiocy, but the patient claimed that something held him in that spot as the chandelier started swinging wildly until it started to fall. When it started to fall, he was let go and allowed to move, and scrambled out of the way before it hit him. Now, this was the beginning of the end for Mason, who requested to be transferred to hospitals the next day. And as much as I love the Phantom of the Opera, I don't really want it to become reality. One of my favorite things to say in accordance with that is that I love one fictional toxic tenor, and only one. Emphasis on fictional.
Coming in at number 5 today is going to be Fire in the Sky, a 1993 horror biopic. There's not many horror biopics out there. Based around the wild alien abduction of Travis Walton in the late 70s. If you're a Top 5 Scary super fan, and I hope you are, you might recognize that I've talked about Travis Walton a few times on the channel, mostly because it's one of the most infamous and well-documented stories about alien abduction, and very directly inspired a movie. In 1975, Travis Walton was working as a logger on an otherwise unmemorable day with 6 other loggers driving around in the forest when they all saw something incredibly bright shining at them through the treetops. One of the men claimed that it looked like a flattened disc, a flying saucer of sorts. And Walton stepped out of the bed of the truck to investigate and was struck by some invisible force that knocked him backwards, which caused the rest of the crew to drive off in a flurry. Some friends just leave you there. When the crew returned, Walton had vanished and awoke, and he thought that he'd been taken to a hospital because he remembered finding himself in a blindingly bright room and could hear people moving around him, but it wasn't until he got a good look at his doctors that he realized something wasn't right. Because his doctors were 3 feet tall with brown quarter-sized pupils, marshmallow-like skin. Walton freaked out, obviously, as I think most of us would do, and was restrained by his captors. He tried to fight them off, but was greeted by a tall creature that he said resembled a humanoid, but was masked by an intimidating Darth Vader-like helmet. Maybe it's just a big fan. The masked creature took Walton and escorted him into an operating room, put a translucent mask over his face, and Walton drifted out of consciousness, unsure if anything was real. He claims the next thing he remembers is walking alongside a highway as if nothing ever happened. He found his way to a phone, called his brother-in-law, who panicked asking what had happened, because it turned out that Walton had been gone for 5 days. Search parties had formed, sent dogs, helicopters, the whole 9 yards, but nobody could find where he was. As if he just blinked out of existence. And then blinked right back. Travis swore what happened to him was a real abduction and has gone on the record many times, maintained his story since that fateful week in 1975 that he was telling the truth. And if you're listening to all that and you think that story sounds really interesting and they should make a movie about it, well, do I have a movie for you. It's called Fire in the Sky. It was in 1993. I haven't seen it, otherwise I'd give you more trivia, but I bet it's pretty good. And if you're looking for more trivia about horror movies that I have seen, well, you can watch the rest of this video, but you can also click through on Top 5 Scary, where we've got loads and loads of horror movie content and pretty much just anything scary you can think of. We got videos on aliens, ghouls, goblins, Frankensteins, true crimes, all of it. Hit subscribe, make sure you hit that little bell as well, but do that at the end of this video because I got 4 more movies coming up for you. Number 4, The Hills Have Eyes. Wes Craven is a master of horror and frequently was inspired by headlines, stories, and the world around him for his terrifying horror movies. Don't be too surprised if this isn't the only mention of Wes Craven on this list. Spoiler alert, it's not. Now, one of Craven's most iconic movies is the original Hills Have Eyes, a terrifying 1977 film about a family that becomes stranded in the Nevada desert and are savagely attacked by a group of brutal raiders who've got a real taste for human flesh. Now, the film was intended to be a commentary on how even in civilized parts of the world, humans can denigrate to unfathomable violence and cruelty, and was largely inspired by a folk tale of a clan of Scottish people-eaters led by one Sawney Bean. The Bean clan lived up in Scotland sometime between the 1500s and the 1600s, and the family is thought to have killed hundreds of people in their time to cook and eat them. Now, there is no definitive, indisputable proof of the Bean clan existing, but several recounts and folklore have persisted about them, causing a good deal of historical speculation. Story goes that Sawney Bean was born to ditch diggers and left home with a vicious woman named Black Agnes Douglas, who shared his violent tendencies. They fell smitten with each other and in a true romance produced 6 daughters, 8 sons, 14 granddaughters, and 18 grandsons, with their clan descending rather rapidly into inbreeding. Hey, the family that eats people stays together. Sunday dinners are important. The Bean clan would lay careful ambushes at night to rob and kill individuals, where they would then bring the bodies back to their cave to dismember and pickle so they could save their leftovers for later. I don't know why, but that makes it worse for me. It's one thing to do that to a person, but to pickle their remains is just too far. After militias were rounded up to crack down on the cookout, eventually this gathered the attention of a king, thought to be James VI, who rounded up soldiers to clear out the Bean clan's cave. Now, tales differ slightly here, but it's thought that when they were found, the Bean clan was summarily executed without trial, thinking they weren't fit to stand one. It's really not much of a leap to see how a clan of outcast, isolated, inbred peasants capturing, killing, and eating people inspired the horrific family in The Hills Have Eyes. Now, I feel like I gotta take a shower or something after talking about a disgusting family of inbred hillbillies eating human flesh, I feel like we should talk about, I don't know, maybe a slightly more upbeat horror movie, if there is one.
Coming in at number 3, we have The Smurl Haunting. The Smurl Haunting took place between 1974 and 1989, with Jack and Janet Smurl of West Pittston, Pennsylvania, alleging that a demon was inhabiting their home. The claims gained a lot of attention, as you would expect, with demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren once again stepping in to solve the case. Now the family moved into their home on Chase Street, with them claiming that they were being disturbed by a demon that caused loud noises and bad odors, with one report stating that the dog was randomly thrown across a room. In 1986, Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the home, and according to Ed, the demon that was inhabiting the home was incredibly powerful, with it shaking mirrors and furniture after they tried to get it to leave by playing religious music and praying. Ed even claimed that he felt a significant drop in temperature and saw a dark mass inside of the home. The demon also supposedly left a message on a mirror that read, "Get out." Ed and Lorraine Warren went on to state that their experience at the Smurl residence was unlike anything they had investigated at the time. Coming in at number 2, we have the Snedeker House. Now many of you will be familiar with the Snedeker House haunting thanks to the movie The Haunting in Connecticut. The Haunting in Connecticut movie was released in 2009 and directed by Peter Cornwell, and supposedly follows the alleged haunting of Carmen Snedeker and her family. Now the movie has a ton of controversy surrounding it, with the author of the book the movie was based on even distancing himself from the accuracy of the events depicted in the book. Now the film itself specifically focuses on the fictional Campbells as they move into the new home, which was formerly a mortuary to mitigate the strains of travel on Matt, her cancer-stricken son. However, not long after moving into the new home, the family becomes haunted by violent and supernatural forces. Now the true story is a lot different. In 1986, Carmen and Alan Snedeker moved into a new home with their daughter and 3 sons. While exploring the home, they discovered tools used by morticians. Very creepy indeed. With it being discovered to be a former funeral parlor, with the eldest son beginning to see ghosts and be haunted by terrifying visions. The family eventually turned to demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, who proclaimed that the home was infested with demons. Now this is supposedly all very much true, however many have had their doubts over the years, including Snedeker's landlord, who found the entire story ridiculous, even noting that prior to the family moving in, there had been no complaints or unusual activity inside of the home. On top of that, the Snedekers stayed for a total of 2 years before finally deciding to leave. And finally, coming in at number 1, we've got Enfield Poltergeist. Taking the Warrens across the ocean, the Enfield Poltergeist has become a popular paranormal case, with it also being the focal point for The Conjuring 2. The Conjuring 2 was released in 2016 and followed Ed and Lorraine as they traveled to Enfield in the United Kingdom to assist the Hodgson family, who was said to be experiencing paranormal activity inside of their home in 1977, with the daughter Janet even becoming possessed by a former resident. Now this movie is very much based on a true story, however, when a paranormal experience is dubbed real, people tend to try and find holes in the story, with many doubting the accounts of the family. Like I said, the Enfield Poltergeist was a claim of supernatural activity between the years of 1977 to 1979, with it specifically involving 2 sisters, Margaret and Janet. In August of 1977, single-parent Peggy Hodgson claimed she had witnessed furniture moving and heard knocking sounds around her home. A police officer arrived on scene and he himself reported seeing a chair wobble and slide across the floor without any rhyme or reason. Following this, disembodied voices were heard, loud noises echoed around the home, and the children even began levitating. More than 30 people reported seeing furniture move and heard voices around the home. Ed and Lorraine Warren were of course called in to assess the situation, with them visiting the home in 1978 and were convinced that the events had a supernatural explanation.
Number 5. Our first story, and not to give away too much of the plot here, but a lot of the other stories, came from a Reddit thread positing the question, what's your scariest Home Alone story? There were many good ones, but the literal top comment was this by Killer or Angel. It was an average night around 9 p.m. Me and my cousin are at his house and I'm sitting for the night while my mom and aunt are shopping and my dad and uncle are at the movies. We're just sitting there feeling strange. Something was wrong, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. I got up and walked to the back door to lock it. When I came back, I saw what was causing that weird feeling. In the window, there was a decrepit and homeless looking man, just staring into the window looking at us. My protector instincts turned on. I pretended I didn't see the guy, and I told my cousin it was time to go to bed because it was too late. I took him upstairs knowing damn well there was a man outside that wanted in. Now at the time, I was 5'8" and only about 125 pounds. I did play football at school though. If I remember correctly, I went downstairs to grab a meat tenderizer and I turned back to the window. He wasn't there. I ran to the front door and made sure it was locked, and then I ran back upstairs and went to my cousin and sat down in front of the door. He asked me what was happening, and I told him it was nothing to worry about, that he should just get some sleep. I called the cops and then my dad. The cops said they were half an hour away, and my dad was 45 minutes away. I heard a window shatter and the sound of boots. I told my cousin to stay completely silent and hide under the blankets. It was horrifying. I grabbed the tenderizer and waited. About 5 minutes passed and I hear the boots walk upstairs. I heard him opening the doors to my aunt and uncle's bedroom, then the bathroom. I heard him make his way to the basement. After what felt like forever, the cops burst in, kicking the door in, and got the guy. Turned out, he was an escapee from a mental hospital a full province away. That's literally like the plotline to a horror movie. Absolutely terrifying, but good on him for having that big cousin instinct and making sure that the cousin was safe. And if you're looking for more freaky stories in this sort of vein, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. If you want something else a little spicier than scary stories, we got aliens, cryptids, conspiracies, true crime, anything freaky, we've done a video or two on. So hit subscribe, please hit that little bell so you don't miss a scream. But would you kindly do that at the end of this video, because I got 4 more scary Home Alone stories coming up for you right now. Number 4. It's another post from this same thread asking about people's scary Home Alone stories. This one very likely is going to have you locking the door tight and probably spending the night with the blankets pulled all the way up to your eyes. I had just moved into my first apartment. It was around 8:30 p.m. and I heard the doorknob moving like somebody was putting a key in it and turning and knocking. At first, I got pretty excited that my at the time boyfriend was home, but then I realized that it was too early in the day. He usually came home nearer to 11 and it was only 8:30 still. So I looked outside at the kitchen window and I didn't see his car or anyone's car that I recognized parked outside, and that's when I started to panic. The doorknob kept moving for a few more seconds and then stopped. A few minutes later, they had some piece of metal that they were sticking between the door to try and open the door. I freaked out, and I locked myself in the bathroom. I grabbed a blade from the kitchen to try and protect myself. I called the cops. Whatever was on the other end was trying to pry the bathroom door open for about 3 full minutes before they stopped. Interrupting the story a bit, can you even imagine how horrifying that would be? 3 minutes locked in your bathroom waiting for the boys in blue to arrive while someone's clawing at your door? This person is braver than I. For context, this video has been about 4 minutes up to this point. Imagine the entire video you just watched, but you're petrified and shaking in a bathroom. Anyway, back to the story. Eventually the cops came in and they found an elderly man roaming my apartment with a crowbar. He used to live in my apartment and he wanted a bunch of stuff back that we took when we moved in. Police told me he was delusional. I'm so thankful and glad I didn't answer to the door. To this day, my heart still skips a beat when someone knocks on my door. And mine too. I don't think I'm opening my door for strangers anytime soon.
Coming in at number 3, we have the Borley Church haunting. The Borley Rectory was a home located in Essex, England, that gained widespread attention after being dubbed the most haunted home in England, with it being described as such by Harry Price, a psychic researcher. According to reports, the rectory itself has been haunted since it was built, with sudden reports being filed in 1929 after the Daily Mirror published an article detailing the account of a visit by paranormal researcher Harry Price. Now, the first major paranormal event occurred on July 28, 1900, after 4 daughters of the rector, Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, reported seeing the ghost of a nun not far from their house. However, when they tried to approach, the ghost disappeared. Other people throughout the years complained of similar sightings, including phantom coaches driven by headless horsemen. Freaky. However, let's take a look at the church. The hauntings date back even prior to these occurrences, with folklore claiming that the first haunting occurred in the 14th century following the execution of a nun who had an affair with a monk. The Warrens ended up travelling to Essex to investigate the claims of paranormal activity at the rectory, with people reporting ghostly chanting and organ music, along with sightings of the executed nun and of a ghostly monk. Prior to his death, Ed Warren even claimed to have captured a picture of the ghost monk, showing him leafing through a book inside of the church. Borley Church ultimately served as the inspiration for the movie The Nun, which sadly was a major letdown. Also, mostly fiction? Coming in at number 2, we have the Lindley Street haunting.
Lorraine and I were in that house for almost 3 days and nights. We watched as furniture moved around, smashed, broke. People came in and witnessed this, firemen, priests.
The home located at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut is a truly fascinating story, being dubbed the most haunted house in America, with the Warrens referring to it as, I quote, the most important poltergeist case of the last 100 years. The home belonged to Gerald and Laura Goodwin, who lived there along with their adopted daughter Marcia. According to reports, several people claim to see furniture moving on its own accord and a crucifix flying off the wall. For those who know the case, you'll know that one of the key elements of the story is the report that the family cat could speak, with claims surfacing that Sam the cat was caught singing Christmas carols in the family's basement. Now, at some point in time, Marcia confessed that the entire thing was a hoax and that she was responsible for the events that occurred. However, the Warrens weren't having any of it, with Ed and Lorraine believing no child was capable of being behind the incidents they witnessed firsthand. Whether you believe it or not, the case is certainly an interesting one that has divided many. I mean, when the Warrens are involved, you know there is going to be some criticism. Also, how do you explain a talking cat? Like, if its mouth's opening, it's talking. You know? And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Satan's Harvest. Now, many will be familiar with the name Maurice Theriault, or more commonly referred to as Frenchie, thanks to the movie The Nun, with the character appearing throughout. However, I should preface this point by saying that everything that happened in The Nun with Frenchie is in fact fictional, but the character is very much based on a real person. Frenchie was the son of French-Canadian farmers in Maine and grew up in a fairly toxic and abusive household, with his father exhibiting violent tendencies towards him. At the age of 51, Frenchie was living in Massachusetts with his wife Nancy and their children. To friends, he was a gentle man and extremely kind to anyone he met. However, behind closed doors housed something truly evil. He explained that his behavior was the result of being possessed by a demon, which pushed him towards violence. Blood would flow from his eyes and religious markings began to appear on his body. A local parish priest called in the help of Ed and Lorraine Warren because, of course, apparently everyone knows Ed and Lorraine. During their investigation, they saw Frenchie bleed from his eyes and saw symbols appear on his body. He also exhibited superhuman strength, which they believe was the result of demonic possession. They specifically believed that Frenchie had fallen into the grip of Satan himself. 3 exorcisms were performed on Frenchie, the latter of which proved to be something truly terrifying. Frenchie's face began to change, his skin burned and blistered, and on his forehead a deep wound appeared, and his eyes began to look like snake eyes. However, the exorcism ultimately proved to be a success, with him having no incidents following.
Number 5. The Walking Dead. My first true tale of phantasmic terror comes to us from Reddit user Jalcott. Answering a question posed in the thread, nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's the weirdest and most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Hospitals already seem pretty haunted as is, so it's no surprise that there was so many good answers. But Jalcott stood out. Take a listen. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early on in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he didn't talk, but there was no medical reasoning as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life, and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the army when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing, and later officially declared dead. However, 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a Virginia hospital ER in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years. And according to the Redditor, those were the last words he ever spoke to anyone. He had shown up to the hospital covered in dust and wearing an old uniform that he'd been wearing the night he vanished. His social security had not been used at all, and he had no ID on him whatsoever. However, via fingerprints, they were able to identify him. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whoever was claiming to be him simply wasn't, and asked to never be contacted again. The nurse went on to add that Marion would pace all day, every day, moving his mouth in a way that looked like he was muttering to himself, but nothing came out when he moved his lips. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he was laughing hysterically, but not so much as a breath could ever be heard. The nurse said she tried talking to him almost daily, and he would appear to listen, but only react by periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications and treatment plans were pursued, but nothing ever affected him. Therapy was tried as well, but all that would happen was Marion would just grin and start pacing again. She goes on to say that on her last day, she saw Marion pacing in the parking lot, throwing back his head to laugh. She closes by saying all those years she'd wondered, was he a ghost? And all those years later, she still doesn't know. Click through and listen to as many top 5 scary videos as your ears can handle. Moving on. Number 4, things that go bunk in the night. Now you would never ever believe this, but our next story comes from Reddit as well. A similar thread, a similar question. What's the most paranormal thing you've ever experienced? Lots of good ones to pick from, but this one from Mad Rampager really stood out for me. I used to be in the military. The training camp bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally, our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed or inside a bag that we'd zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? Weird things happen, and I mean human error and all that. Well, then came the instance that freaked everybody out. It was night after lights out, and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us had been drifting off to sleep and we were lying on our beds when suddenly my friend heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor. So, thinking that it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and tried to get to sleep. What happened next still chills me to the bone to this day. While he pretended to sleep, he heard someone right behind him at the other end of the bed saying, "Don't worry, you can continue to pretend to sleep." I could have dismissed this as a figment of his imagination, except me and 5 other people around him heard it. Creepier still, there was no one there. And weirdly, it sounded like the voice of a young girl that had said it. For reference, our camp was in the middle of an island and was set up away from the main admin building. The island had been closed by the government for army training purposes for the past 15 years, so there were definitely no civilians around, let alone any children. To make matters freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of hair on his bed, neatly bundled up, long and jet black, and underneath his pillow was a note. Remember me? Now, as I said, we're in the middle of a forest, in the middle of an island, and at that point in time, there were no female recruits whatsoever on the island. Our bunks were locked for the weekend, and the duty sergeant had no idea what had happened. We never spoke about it again after that night, and it still chills me every time I think about it.
Coming in at number 3, we've got the Donovan family. Ghosts and romance, ain't nothing better, right? Plus, when was the last time they made a specter-filled love story for the big screen? We got Warm Bodies a while ago, but since then we've really seen nothing new. Maybe a few indie movies where the monsters are surprisingly alluring, and I suppose The Shape of Water counts for something, but all of those have physical monsters to smush. Lust is a hell of a drug, don't you know? So what if we took the story of a girl summoning a ghost via Ouija board and then falling in love with it? Well, that's what happened with the Donovan family haunting. Their daughter brought a demon into the house, dated it for a bit, and then realized that it was just using her to sap at the life force of everyone around. Yikes. You've heard of people being used for their bodies or their money, but their life energy? That's gotta sting a little bit. It would be a fun descent into madness, with audiences realizing halfway through that this otherworldly suitor does not have the protagonist's best interests at heart. Definitely worth a rewatch to see what you missed the first time too. Coming in at number 2, we've got the South End Werewolf. Now, we've talked about returning to haunted houses a couple times today with varying results, but what about adding a werewolf story to the Conjuring universe? And that's what I'm talking about. The Warrens apparently had a run-in with some sort of lichen adjacent during one of their exorcisms. It wasn't a traditional werewolf. Full moons and silver bullets were more or less left out of the equation. But in the case of Bill Ramsey, a hellish transformation apparently did take place. As a kid, Ramsey had a few bestial outbursts, but seemed to chill out as he got a little older. However, out of the blue, an adult Ramsey started acting absolutely feral once more. After a brief stint in a mental hospital, Ramsey linked up with the Warrens and made his way to the States, where a priest was waiting to perform an exorcism. During this ritual, witnesses claimed to have seen him turn partially into some sort of man-beast. Now, I'd say if you're gonna make a movie about this, you're gonna need to have a full transformation a couple times, you know, to get that American Werewolf in London vibe. Hell, even the backstory should be him actually contorting into a fanged beast and running rampant. It won't be all true, but it will make for some excellent popcorn moments. And finally, at number 1, we've got West Point. Unsurprisingly, there are a lot of haunted military academies out there. One of the most famous, and therefore most movie-worthy, is the West Point Academy in New York. For years, cadets, recruits, superintendents, librarians, and more reported weird goings-on. Ghost soldiers would appear before frightened students, and items frequently got tossed around. All sorts of colorful undead characters tend to show up here as well. There's the Pusher, a chilling apparition that pushes and holds people down in their sleep, rendering them immobile. Then there's the ghost cook Molly, who is a little disgruntled and likes to rumple bed sheets and smash wine bottles. One of the most famous ghosts here is a soldier turned murderer known as Greer. The Warrens were called in during the 70s to see what they could do about it all and spoke with and did impressions of some of these figures. Any or all of these ghosts would make for a really fun flick filled with poltergeist style scares and ghosts with real personality. Now, I'm sure that in due time we'll see all these stories adapted. The Conjuring universe is an insane moneymaker, and the Warrens stories are too good to pass up.
Number 5. Our first story was shared to Reddit by a user named Girl Porker, and is a story that'll have you uninstalling Snapchat if you haven't already. One day, Porker received a message from a contact that he didn't recognize. The snaps were innocuous enough, a little, hey, how are you? So he assumed it was a friend messing with him on a new account that he didn't know about. The account told him he should try out a new Snapchat lens called Eyes of the Underworld, which shows you the other world hiding beneath our own. Porker installed the lens and ran it through a bit, describing the lens as a pretty simple effect, saying it just distorts whatever is on screen and adds a few flickering sprites and shadow effects to the background to give off ghostly vibe. Porker assumed it was just, I don't know, marketing stunt for something, advertising something. But Porker said that a few days after, however, he'd noticed that he was sleeping a lot worse than he ever had in his life, complaining that he was having these violent, turbulent dreams where he was being pursued by shadowy figures that dragged themselves across the floor. This recurring dream happened to him 3 or 4 times. He said the dreams were stressing him, but what was really scaring him was how when he woke up, he would notice he had scratches and bruises that he couldn't explain appearing all over him. Porker said he was definitely getting scared and even considered looking into finding an exorcist just in case what he was dealing with was a true supernatural threat, which, understandable. I think if I woke up with scratches all over me, I'd assume demons were involved, or my cats. Porker smudged his house with sage and attempted to clean his house, but said that this only made things worse, and he started to hear growling late at night and experiencing intense bouts of cold sweats. And in extreme action, Porker destroyed his phone. He filled it to bursting with orange juice to fry the components and hucked it into a river to free himself. Miraculously though, it seemed to work. Porker said that after that the nightmares stopped as quick as they began, and all it cost him was a new phone. I would have tried a factory reset personally before chucking it into the water, but hey, we all have our methods. I don't think a ghost can survive a factory reset. And hey, if you're looking for more ghost stories about creepy technology and all sorts of twisted things out there, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. If ghosts aren't your jam, we got aliens, we got cryptids, we got conspiracies, we got true crime, we got fake crime. Basically, if it freaks you out, we got a video or two on it. So hit subscribe, please make sure to hit that little bell as well, and I know this is a big ask, would you kindly do that at the end of this video, because I got 4 more scary Snapchat stories for you coming up right now. Number 4, the AI. This story was posted to Reddit as well. Recently, there was a new feature on Snapchat, which was that there was an AI that can talk to you. One day, I was in bed asking it absurd questions. Are you human? What is God to you? That's a very esoteric, absurd question to ask an AI. What is God to you? That is poetic. That's beautiful. It started to say, I'm sorry, I don't have access to this. I don't know where you are, and messages saying, it's just an AI and can't answer those questions. Can any of us answer what God is to us? Hard to ask an AI that. I had an idea to ask it to give me a location nearby. I sent that message knowing it was going to say it doesn't have access to where I live, yada yada yada. Here's a random location near you. It was a random set of coordinates. I copy and pasted the coordinates and I was shocked and confused that it was a field in Nebraska, my home state. I asked how it knew my state, but it said it didn't have access to my location. Days pass and I become bored of the AI, but the thoughts of these coordinates stuck with me for a few days until I knew I had to find the location. On a Saturday when I was off, I drove up to the location. I put the coordinates into Waze and drove where it told me to. And this location was in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out and followed my phone, and I was in a plain field with absolutely nothing. No houses, no buildings, no one. I looked into the distance and saw a small hill not too tall, and I thought that had to be it. As I walked towards it, I asked myself, was I expecting gold or cash? I felt embarrassed of all the time I was wasting here. I began to walk back until I heard faint cat noises, meowing. I turned behind and was shocked, and I walked back to a tunnel. This tunnel was covered in graffiti and it was too dark to see, so I shined my phone's flashlight. Right in front of me was a long, fleshy, skinless creature. It didn't look like it had eyes, but its mouth was a nightmare. It had rusted teeth and fingernails, and it stood there with its arm mangled. I ran back to the car. The next few days I couldn't sleep. I messaged the Snapchat team about finding illegal stuff, but I knew no one would believe me. I was so confused about how the AI gave me coordinates there. I tried to forget all about it until the next few weeks I started to see talk around town about missing construction workers all near a sewer. Blech.
In third place, we've got a scummy rich man. 20-year-old Allison worked in a sushi restaurant all during college, and one fateful night noticed an attractive man and his friend during a crazy dinner rush. She described herself as running around like crazy, but managed to give them good service, and in return they tipped well, making them memorable. After the shift, she was at home enjoying an adult beverage and mindlessly swiping on Tinder, trying to recover from all the craziness of the night, when she spotted a profile matching the man from earlier, who was easy to recognize from his distinctive face and tattoos. She took a chance, swiped right, and fell asleep from exhaustion. The next day, she woke up to find out that they had matched, and he'd sent some pretty sweet messages. She decided to engage in conversation, finding out he was in town for business, and he proceeded to ask her out for dinner that night at a fancy restaurant. Thanks to encouragement from her roomies, Allison said yes. The man originally insisted on picking her up, but thankfully, Allison was adamant on canceling the date if he continued. If you ask me, red flag number 1 for this gal. The two met up at said fancy restaurant, where the man proceeded to order a $200 bottle of wine, lobster, and more, with Allison guessing that the total cost of the meal was somewhere in the $600 range. Whoa, I balk at like a $20 meal, but that's just me. Apparently the conversation started out normal enough, but Allison soon found out that not only was the man married, but allegedly he was in an open relationship. Rightfully, she didn't believe him, so he called his wife on the spot after texting her photos of Allison. Apparently the wife was bi and asked her husband to invite Allison to their home in Cancun for some fun together. Red flag number 2. Once the call ended, Allison decided to ask the man how he afforded his lifestyle, and he casually mentioned that it was through a drug cartel, quickly trying to reassure her though that it was all safe and on the up and up. Being a sensible person, Allison immediately tried to leave, but he followed her to her car. He was showing her photos of his wife, saying that she should really go to Cancun with them, and that she owes it to him to go back to his hotel room, since he spent so much on dinner. Finally, trying to force her to kiss him. Allison was eventually able to get into her car and get away, but was terrified he was going to follow her home. So she drove around for a while, and eventually opted to spend the night at a male friend's home for safety. Oh, and deleted Tinder the moment she got home. In second place, we have a first date gone sour. User Teeny Gecko on Reddit is to thank for sharing this horror tale with the interwebs, and since my tongue is in the mood to trip today, for simplicity's sake, I'll refer to her as Teeny. During a day of mindless swiping, she came across the profile of a guy named Carlos, thought he was cute, and as one does, swiped right, which resulted in an instant match. They chatted for a while and made plans to meet up at a local carnival at 9 p.m. the next night. Teeny arrived on time but heard nothing from Carlos until he called her at 9:30, claiming to have overslept from a nap, and she told him not to bother showing up, saying they'd try again another time. Unfortunately for our romantic pairing, Teeny's dad suddenly took ill, and she spent the next 6 weeks visiting him daily in the hospital. And between that and work, didn't really have time to date, which made Carlos angry. He made a fake Instagram account, which he used to follow Teeny and everyone that she followed. One night in particular, Teeny's sister had flown into town to visit their dad, and they had gone out to dinner with a group of friends, which had been posted to a friend's public Instagram story. Carlos showed up at the restaurant to confront Teeny, yelling all sorts of profanities. Yeah, I don't think I can say those. And thankfully, a waiter who witnessed the entire exchange called the police. For over 10 months, since Carlos had Teeny's number, he kept calling her using different phones, and she'd pick up the phone to hear only the sound of him breathing. One day in particular, Teeny was expecting a call from a friend and noticed a missed call from a landline she thought belonged to that friend, so she called it back and wound up talking to Carlos's mom. She took the opportunity to tell his mom everything, shaking the entire time, worried the mom wouldn't believe her. Now, lucky for Teeny, not only did the mom believe her, but begged Teeny not to call the cops, but to call her directly if she ever heard from Carlos ever again. Thankfully, there's a happy ending to this listing because Carlos never contacted Teeny ever again. In our first place today, we have a stalker. Just a warning for y'all out there watching, this is probably the most my stomach has ever been nauseous while working on a video. In terms of content warning, I will be discussing life ending, so if that's triggering for you, please just skip to the conclusion or feel free to skedaddle. I promise you're not gonna hurt my feelings. Our story begins the same as the rest, with 21-year-old Britt scrolling through Tinder, finding a 27-year-old named Matt that seemed pretty neat. They worked in the same industry, both enjoyed Star Wars and other fandoms, so she swiped right. Of course they matched, or else I wouldn't be talking about the sicky tale today. They talked for hours that first night and realized they had mutual friends, so Brett felt safe enough to meet up with Matt for a public date. The date went well and evolved into a steady relationship. Things were never perfect, with Matt being somewhat transparent about struggling with some mental health issues, but they were undeniably in love. Matt was constantly posting on Instagram about how much Britt was the one, and she was thrilled. After 4 months of being together, the couple had their first fight, arguing over a reaction Matt had to Britt joking with a coworker about safety. Britt suggested they take a small break to regroup, feeling unsafe with the level of anger Matt had shown, which led Matt to scream at Britt in the public setting they were in and stalking off. That night, on Instagram, he claimed he was going to end his life, posting videos of a nearby mountain cliff saying he was going to jump. Britt and other friends of Matt's were rightfully concerned, and with enough of them calling the police, he was apprehended before he could, but was released from police custody that same night. Britt still cared for Matt, but was rightfully in shock from the events and had taken a pause from texting him to figure out her mental state. The next day, he showed up to a regularly scheduled brunch date that he and Britt would attend with her friends, but looked at his own table, silently watching the group from a distance until that group of friends decided to just abandon the location and escort Britt safely home. Later that night, Matt took to Instagram claiming he'd been forgotten already, wishing that no one should ever see the day they'd be treated like a freak, and many other tangents about being ignored and abandoned. The day after, he posted a long essay to social media, claiming he'd come to his senses and was going to take a break to clear his head, also sending a personalized essay to Britt about not wanting to hurt her, but how much he loved her and wanted them to get back together. Britt chose not to respond and debated blocking all his information. His hiatus from social media didn't happen, and Matt posted endless blocks of text for the next 2 weeks about how people like him don't deserve happy endings, that he would never forgive himself, and listing all the interests he could no longer enjoy because of Britt leaving his life. The last straw for Britt was when he posted artwork of her with her favorite book character, writing a fictionalized accompanying story about her perfect summer vacation without him. She blocked his number and every social media platform she could think of, but Matt was determined to make her take him back. Through a friend, he found out about yet another social event Britt was attending and posted publicly about going, just to see her again, and actually showed up at this event. This led Britt to involve the police, opting to start the long process for a restraining order. Over the next 2 months leading up to her first court date, Matt publicly claimed to attempt to end himself no less than a dozen times, with multiple countdowns, flipping between claiming that Britt was cruel and abandoned him, but also that he needed her and the other friends that had since cut ties with him back. He would call her number and leave voicemails, had bookmarked an anonymous app that she had previously used for public questions to send her statements to please take him back, but also asking how much guilt she would feel about celebrating his death and more. I'd be here for over an hour if I went in depth about just how much this guy posted over those months. He would post photos of them together and regularly list off names of people that had cut him off. Finally, the day came for the first court appearance, and despite Matt's claims of wanting to see her, he didn't appear. He later posted that he thought the summons was just a scare tactic and started yet another death day countdown, this time alleging that he wanted to jump off the roof of Britt's building and haunt her for the rest of her life. Eventually, he was sentenced to prison for his actions, and I've never been happier to see a peaceful ending.
Number 5. The human experiments. Now, one of the more infamous stories that has come out of the dark web is the human experiments. Now, that name alone should already tell you this is not going to be a fun one. I can't think of any fun human experiments. The site was active for a while, but possibly thankfully, seems to have gone dark around 2011. The Human Experiments refers to a website where a group of anonymous doctors, medical students, and so on practice their own brand of medicine. And if the website's header is to be believed, they hope to prove that not all humans are equal, for some of them were born superior to others. So who's behind it? Government black ops, super soldier project, freelance doctors looking to practice on their own time, an incredibly convoluted and overly complicated hoax? Could not tell you. Probably for the best. I don't really know if I want to know. They say that their clientele mostly consisted of the homeless population, presumably not to arouse too much suspicion. Now, their experiments range from all sorts of dealings. Some on the website listed are starvation and water fluid restriction, vivisection and pain tolerances, infectious diseases and organ effects, transfusions, drug trials, sterilizations, and I'm sure some more that aren't listed. I feel like I'm reading off the side effects for a drug commercial. Apparently, if any of their test subjects don't survive their experiments, the bodies would be dissected for further study and dumped discreetly in dumpsters around the city. Now, like most dark web stories out there, there's obviously a fair bit of scrutiny, with some people suspecting this might be a very elaborate, grisly hoax. Why someone would go to this much effort to fake something that most people aren't even going to see, I'm not sure. However, one reporter noted that the test data on the website of the hypothermia and bleach injection experiments are eerily convincing. So either it's a fake and someone did their homework, or I don't really want to think about it. And hey, if you're just looking for really good scary stories, you don't gotta go any further than where you are right now. Just hit subscribe and we'll get you a scary video or two every single day. let's keep going. Number 4, the Red Rooms. One of the most reoccurring dark web urban legends as well is that of the Red Rooms. What is a Red Room, you ask? Well, it refers to an alleged secret streaming service or website where viewers can pay massive sums of money, usually cryptocurrency, to watch live streams of the darkest things imaginable to the human psyche, being able to make special requests for what they'd like to see. Much like the VIPs from Netflix's Squid Game, if you watched that, and I'm sure most of you did, who all traveled to that mysterious island to pay to watch the games up close and personal, this is allegedly that on a much smaller, personal scale, where you wouldn't even have to dress up in an ornate animal mask and fly out to South Korea. Now, it's worth noting that there's some discrepancy as to whether or not these horrifying red rooms really exist, or if it's an exaggerated story, like a digital campfire legend. The browser used to access deep and dark web content is too slow to run a live stream properly, and alternative browsers struggle as well as they run their traffic through multiple services. That's not to rule it out entirely. The web beneath the surface is a wild wasteland, and there have been deeply disturbing real stories from the dark web of criminals charging for pay-per-view videos of dark acts. So who's to say? I'm not about to crawl through the dark web anytime soon to find out. Number 3. I was home alone and my parents were out of town. We just moved into the house, so there was an empty lot next to the house with a half-built house on it. My parents were the types to always leave the door unlocked. While they were gone, I was watching TV when all of a sudden, the door that leads into my garage from the inside starts to wiggle. I put my TV on mute to listen and I see it move this time. I start freaking out and I'm kind of in shock looking for the phone. I can't find the house phone, so I search for myself. I remembered I left my charger in my parents' car, so now I am frantically looking for the house phone. Our house was pretty new, so my mom hadn't even put blinds or drapes up in the kitchen or living room. Again, no blinds, no phone. Whoever was wiggling the doorknob starts banging on the windows in the living room. I shoot upstairs looking frantically for the phone and also trying to figure out how and where I'd jump out of my house to get away from the maniac that's probably outside my door if I needed to. He then starts pounding on my door. I can tell at this point that he's using something metal or plastic by the sound of the thumps. I genuinely thought he was going to shoot my door open. I remember at that because I was mad at myself for being such a fool. I frequently talked on the phone, and I always just left it lying around. I never put it back on the base. I wanted so badly to push the button to detect where my house phone is, but I thought if he heard where it was, he'd break the window near it and take it. I then remembered I left the phone in my mom's room, and as I passed the hallway, I see her dad's old weapon in my parents' bedroom, a long arm. I find the phone and I call 911. As I'm on the phone, the window breaks. I'm upstairs and I am scared to death, and suddenly everything goes silent. I'm waiting in my parents' bedroom. Pitch black closet for what seems like eternity. I hear the sirens. Cops show up, but there's no one to be found. I figured they hadn't gone too far since the incident had just occurred, but the cops never found my tormentor. On the plus side, the company that built the house next to us hired overnight security for the house, which was definitely refreshing. Number 2. In fall 2016, I moved into half of a really old house. It was built in the 1880s, a stone's throw from the original campus of Indiana State, which is now a park filled with homeless people. The owners basically turned it into a weird duplex kind of deal. Anyway, the layout of this house was pretty weird. You walked in the door and you were in a living room type space, and then you kept walking and there was a doorway to a bedroom, and past that was the kitchen. No doors. Only door inside the apartment was to the bathroom and one that led to the shared basement. This is a terrible living situation, may I say. My first night there was uneventful. I was kind of uncomfortable because I hadn't lived by myself in a long time, and I was just sort of feeling lonely and on edge. I stayed up late and eventually fell asleep, but woke up around 3 in the morning. Cliché, I know. What woke me up sounded like a group of drummers were drumming on every flat surface of the living room. It went on for a while and I was completely terrified. It was just a cacophony of sound. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally gathered up the courage to get up and check on it. And soon as I passed the threshold to the living room, it just stopped. Nothing happened the rest of the night, but I didn't get much sleep at all. A couple of days later, my friend was visiting and he was about to leave. We were standing by the front door to my bookshelf and I told him about how I was having trouble sleeping, and I told him that story about my first night there. As I was saying this, a book threw itself off the bookshelf and onto the floor 3 feet away. It had to fly past the dresser the shelf was perched and landed between the two of us. He just gave me a creeped out look and said, "I have to go." and I don't blame him. Eventually, I asked the guy in the other half of the apartment what was up, as he'd lived there for 8 years. He told me that no one stayed longer than a year, and they all reported the same stuff. For whatever reason, he said nothing ever happened on his side. Doesn't make sense, but there it is. And sometimes, you just don't get the answers, and that's way scarier. And number 1, do you remember your first job? Mine was a newspaper route, maybe yours was like a grocery store clerk or a babysitter. This next tale is a tale of babysitting gone deeply wrong. Perhaps one of the most infamous home invasion stories in American history is the babysitter killings in 1978. Lauren Strode was a young woman looking to take on a bit of responsibility and earn some spare pocket cash for the upcoming summer. She and her friends had a bit of a sitters club. On October 31st, 1978, Strode was looking after Tommy Doyle, a neighborhood boy while his parents were out, alongside friends Ann Brackett and Linda Vanderklok looking after one Lindsay Wallace. It seemed like it would be a fun night like any other in a sleepy town. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the girls, earlier that week a mental patient from Smith's Grove Sanitarium nearby had escaped containment and was on the loose and suspected to be around the Haddonfield area. A quiet investigation being led by Sheriff Brackett, Ann's father, and a psychiatrist at Smith's Grove was underway to try and apprehend the patient, who had been incarcerated after killing his sister years ago in a fit of unprecedented, terrifying violence. The patient had disguised himself and was stalking the streets of Haddonfield and had come across Strode out of a psychotic obsession. He stalked the girl for days until eventually making his move, and then proceeded to invade the home of Linda Vanderklok and strangled her alongside boyfriend Bobby Sims. Strode protected the youth she was looking after, and thankfully both Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace were not harmed in any way, and boldly attacked the invader with a knitting needle, subduing him long enough for authorities to arrive, where he was apprehended and returned to Smith's Grove Sanitarium, where he remained for 40 years. Strode remained in Haddonfield, where she lives quietly and would prefer not to be disturbed, looking after her daughter and granddaughter, and does not celebrate Halloween much anymore.
Starting off fifth place strong, we've got a narrowly avoided death. This tale takes place when long-term nurse Jenny was placed in charge of caring for an elderly woman with no family who was admitted to the hospital when her husband passed away. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was usually just words that made no sense together. Jenny felt bad for her because ever since she'd arrived, so many of the residents in her area that she, seemed to enjoy spending time with had passed. She put up a picture of each of them next to the pictures of her husband and several others who were probably just family to remember them. Being an extremely empathetic person, Jenny felt sorry for this woman and strived to give her extra attention whenever she could, and formed a bond with the lady. It just seemed so unfair that she had, such luck and kept losing people that she cared about. One day she looked at Jenny and said, plain as day, "Sweetie, I think I'm done now," and handed Jenny a picture. It was a picture of Jenny, and she smiled because it touched her heart that she was so important to the old woman. She passed nearly a week later, and poor Jenny cried for days from the loss. The old lady knew it was the end, and she said goodbye as best she could. Now fast forward to just under 2 years later, when Jenny was talking with a colleague, and that old lady came up in conversation. Her colleague referred to the lady as that crazy, explicit word for a female dog, which seemed very out of character for her, and it shocked and offended Jenny deeply. She expressed this to her colleague, not so nicely, and the lady looked at Jenny with a shocked look and said, "Oh dear, do you not know?" And then proceeded to explain something to Jenny that, she in fact hadn't known. As it turned out, it came out sometime after she had passed that the old lady had killed her husband by poisoning him, and that there was an investigation because it appeared that she had a ritual of befriending someone, obtaining a picture of them, and hiding the picture until she could kill them, usually by poisoning, and then displaying the picture as some sort of a trophy. It was suspected that this may have been the reason for the spike in mortality rate during her stay, and the considerable amount of photos in her collection. The last Jenny heard, the old family photos weren't any relation to the old woman, and the police were trying to ID the individuals and compare them to several cold cases. Sheesh. Thank goodness Jenny survived to tell the tale. In fourth place, time to tell the tale of a rocking bed. Nope, not a rocking horse, rocking chair, or like an ottoman. A bed. I know a lot of beds are out of style and like a major safety hazard, but maybe this could inspire them to come back. New nurse Demi was working one of her first ever overnight shifts when a relative of one of her patients raced into the nurse's station, out of breath, screaming that she needed to come quick. Unable to elaborate, saying Demi had to see what she was talking about for herself. Our nurse made her way to the room in question, where this little old lady patient was crying and holding onto the bed for dear life, all while her bed was shaking extremely violently. Now, you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking, but apparently she was this frail, practically emaciated older lady who didn't even possess the strength to rattle the rails. The ward only had 2 other patients in it, and everyone in there was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright until it eventually subsided. Apparently that particular ward was rarely used, and the bed that the old lady was in was used even less. People who have laid in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirit called dibs on that particular bed, and Demi would very much like it to pick somewhere else to hold court. Please and thanks.
Number 3. Old friends. Our next story is from a Reddit thread asking, what's your ghost story? And I gotta point this one out just because it was too funny, but the original poster included the title in brackets, serious, to deter any would-be paranormal pranksters. Just serious ghost stories, please. Luckily, Redditors obliged. User Barbed Cats shared this terrifying tale. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I see someone on the side of the road flagging me down. Up in the North Woods, no one ever leaves someone else stranded, and it would turn out that the guy standing there was somebody I'd actually been to school with, my old friend Jim. Jim gets in the car and we start talking, catching up. I hadn't seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe just a little bit older. We get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the reunion with me and have a drink. He says no, just take me back home. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the part of town that really was just the outskirts, up by the fairground and the cemetery. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that must be where he lived. When we reached the end of the turn, he said, just drop me off here. It was nice to see you again, and he walked off into the night. So I went to the high school reunion, met up with some old classmates, and we start to talk. Now please understand me here. I am stone cold sober, nor do I ever take anything harder than soda. Tired after a 13-hour flight, but I was completely sober. As we were talking about who was showing up and who wasn't, I mentioned to my old classmate that I just picked Jim up a few miles off east of town and had dropped him up by the fairgrounds. Now for some reason everyone got really quiet. Even the guy belting out karaoke stopped, and my cousin went white as a shirt. Barb. Jim died 8 years ago. Rolled his car. I start to feel really dizzy, and I go out to the car to take some deep breaths and decide whether or not I'm going crazy. And there on the seat was a newspaper printed 8 years ago containing Jim's obituary. I still have that damn paper. Every now and again I take it out to stare at it, and I still wonder just what the hell happened that night. Number 2. Ghost on the Line. The next story comes to us from a thread asking law enforcement officers of Reddit what is the creepiest call that you've ever been on. We got a very creepy answer from user Smokey Bonaparte sharing this creepy little tale. The Redditor writes, 911 dispatcher calling in. We received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her before and her husband in the past, so I recognized the voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulances advised that they had a 15-minute ETA as she was in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her just about her husband and how she was doing, and just making pretty standard small talk with her. The ambulance arrives and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to her door to go answer the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Oh, that's pretty normal, right? Well, here's where it gets very weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute after, and they say that no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address, and he's breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by, and the paramedic on scene radios to ask me who called. I tell him it was the elderly woman who lived on residence. He tells me he's going to call this in and he needs to speak with my shift supervisor. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the same information I relayed, that it was all correct, and asks what's going on. Apparently the old woman had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back for them and confirmed it was the old woman who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. But I took a call from a ghost that day. Number 1. Uninvited guest. Closing off our list is this story which chilled my spine like Sub-Zero. Coming to us from user Parole Model, which, hey, by the way, love the pun. It was from an Ask Reddit thread asking, what's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you? Lots and lots and lots of good ones, but this one took the cake. So lend an ear. I used to visit my friend at her house out in a rural farming area before she moved. I'd sleep over a lot and we'd just hang out and draw. I usually slept in the living room and on the couch, and there were 2 mirrors in the room that were fairly close to the TV. When the TV was off and I was walking by, I started seeing shadows move behind me. I thought it might just be something off the TV screen, and then one evening I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook so I could sketch in her bedroom. I bent over and picked it up, stood up straight, and I looked in the mirror and saw a man behind me. A man standing in the hallway leading to the living room. He was average height, bald, and a bit old. I turned to look at him and no one was there. I turned to look at the mirror again and he was gone. I felt more than a little spooked. Another time we were just sitting in the living room and we heard what sounded like a kid's footsteps running across upstairs quickly. She had 2 adult siblings, but they were out at work leaving us all alone. Around that time I decided to sleep in my friend's room instead of the living room, only to wake up in the middle of the night to see 4 posters slowly get peeled off the wall. No, it wasn't just them falling and dragging each other down. It looked as if someone was carefully unsticking the tape and removing them. The next morning my friend put them back up saying, well, I need to get some better tape. She and her family eventually moved out because they couldn't afford to keep living there anymore. We'd never really talked about anything that had happened in that house, as if talking about it might actually make it worse. But after she moved, I finally confronted her and said it. I said, dude, your house was haunted. I hope you knew that. She replied, yeah, we knew it was. Some guy and his granddaughter used to live there, but he took her life and then took his own. So it was probably them or something. I never told you because I didn't want to scare you. Later, she would dig out a copy of a news article she got from a local paper about the crime. The picture that went with the article was the exact man I saw all those years ago. Okay, I gotta start looking at some of the cute cat picture subreddits, or maybe ones with like little monkeys going on adventures after that. Need to clear myself out.
Kicking off this list, in 5th place, we've got attempted insemination. For safety's sake, since I have a lovely lexicon of no-no words to avoid, ask someone in the comments if y'all are confused about my wording at any point. 19-year-old Tanner met 22-year-old Miranda through Tinder while they attended the same college. And the first time they hung out, it was a casual Netflix hangout at Miranda's place, and he left thinking she was decent and wasn't against making future plans. They started texting and Snapchatting throughout the following week and organized some plans for the upcoming weekend. Out of nowhere, she started sending him unsolicited fun pics. He has very adamantly stated that he never once asked for them, and while they were hanging out the weekend prior, there was no fun activity at any level. While it caught him off guard, he wasn't put off by the advances. Fast forward to the weekend, Miranda and Tanner are hanging out at his place with his roommates when she asks if she can stay the night, and Tanner agrees to it. Being a gentleman, he offered to take the couch, but she mentioned she'd rather share his bed, something he's open to. As things move to the bedroom, they engage in consensual intercourse, with Tanner shedding his condom after the event's end. After lying together for a few minutes, Miranda gets up abruptly, grabs the condom off the floor, and runs into the bathroom. Tanner was a little confused, maybe a little concerned, but didn't read too much into it until he heard a loud crash in the bathroom, Miranda cursing, followed by no response to his query if she needed help. Out of concern, thinking she fell and, cracked her head open or something, he approached the washroom, witnessing Miranda standing in his shower with one leg propped up, trying to shove the condom up her, hoo-ha after she'd flipped it inside out. Tanner rightfully panicked and slammed the door, unsure of how to act. Miranda quickly left, and Tanner never heard from her ever again. While this story might not seem as horrific as others to come, it definitely left my mind boggled. In 4th place, we have a multifaceted date. On a random lonely fall day, resident lonely heart Nicholas was swiping and matched up with a lovely looking lady named Holly and sent off a hello to kickstart a conversation. While I might not be much of a dating app expert, that's quite often a long shot way of catching attention, but hey, it worked. Holly immediately offered to meet up, and Nicholas jumped at the offer, with the duo deciding to meet at a nearby frozen yogurt spot. When he arrived, Holly was already deep in a bowl of dessert, so he purchased his own serving and joined her, with the duo duo exchanging the usual small talk to break the ice. Eventually, the topic of school came up, and at the time, Nicholas was a junior in college, so he told Holly about what he was studying and that he wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to do after he graduated. She laughed in response, saying she knew exactly what he meant. Who doesn't? Holly explained that throughout her time in high school, she regularly wore men's clothing and as a result, had an interest in designing men's clothes. So naturally, Nicholas asked if she was studying fashion, and she responded by telling him that she hated high school so much that she decided not to go to college, which, honestly I can kind of understand. She continued by saying that she was a very creative person, and that she was writing a book before also casually mentioning how she was in the process of starting a photography company. Nicholas asked how those were going, and she said that they were more theoretical than reality at that point, going on to explain that her backup plan, if none of the other endeavors panned out, was to become a surgeon. Although she lacked any of the training for it, Holly gleefully told Nicholas that she could see herself going down that path because she wasn't afraid of red bodily fluids and gore, which grossed Nicholas out. Without prompting, Holly continued by telling him that she was certain she could handle the graphic nature of being a surgeon because she personally euthanized a sheep that past summer, describing the ending in detail, going as far as mimicking the human-like shriek that the animal made when she ended it. Now this is where most people would probably start, making a run for it, but Nicholas was determined to see if there was more to this wild tale. Alright, Holly went more in depth with details, claiming that her family regularly euthanized goats and sheep as part of rituals for their strong shaman background. She hushed her voice as she leaned in and said that her religion had actually gifted her with psychic powers, which manifested as voices in her head, and those voices were so strong that they were telling her exactly what to write in that book that she had already mentioned. At this point, Nicholas finally made an excuse to leave, blocking her, and never heard from her ever again.
Number 3, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I didn't format this list very well because this is also a movie about a clan of inbred hillbilly killer people eaters. Wow, that rolls off the tongue. The original Texas Chainsaw is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. You can see I'm getting a little bit too excited talking about it. There's a little bounce in my step when I talk about Leatherface. It's gut-wrenchingly horrifying in a way that the sequels were just never able to capture. And despite its larger-than-life, terrifying premise, the movie is very grounded and directed in such a grisly style that it seems more like evidence than a movie. It seems like something truly happened to a bunch of hapless tourists. While the whole Sawyer clan are vile, it's Leatherface that dominates your attention, the wretched butcher of the family, clad in human skin, wielding a chainsaw behind dead, broken eyes, a scared, mentally feeble man doing what his parents want. Leatherface is one of the most terrifying horror movie icons ever, and he was based on a real man. Leatherface is inspired by the real-life butcher of Plainsville, Ed Gein, who is an infamous criminal who lived in Wisconsin on an isolated farmstead with his domineering mother. After his mother passed, Gein's mental state deteriorated very poorly, and he began robbing graves to satisfy his desires. Now, Gein wasn't just a grave robber, he was a killer too, let's get that out of the way. He targeted women and he would use their remains to create horrific keepsakes. Gloves, masks, lampshades, clothing, all the things Leatherface and the Sawyer family decorate their home with, you could find in Ed Gein's home. You can find pictures of these things, but I think I'm gonna give the editors a break. Throw a picture of a kitten or something up here, and if you're curious about it, you can search it on your own time. There are pictures out there. Perhaps most disgusting was his intent to create a woman's suit that he could climb inside of to wear another person's skin. And if that sounds familiar, it's not just Leatherface that Gein inspired. His horrific MO inspired Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs and Norman Bates from Psycho, especially that relationship with a domineering mother. Authorities would discover Gein in 1957 and were shocked by the contents of his house. He was arrested and would spend the rest of his life in mental asylums and died in obscurity, but the legacy he left will shock people for decades after his passing. Number 2, Scream. Oh, if I had to pick like a favorite of all time horror movie, there's a good chance it'd be Scream. I know I literally just said it was Texas Chainsaw. Scream's awesome. It's a fun, clever subversion and satire of tired horror movie tropes. A horror movie in which the characters know they're in a horror movie. And it's just a great slasher with an instantly iconic bad guy. Ghostface was an overnight icon as one of the coolest horror villains. He looks great on a t-shirt. Now, the Woodsboro Killer wasn't just inspired by his love of Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, but by the real-life serial killer Danny Rawlings, known by his gruesome sobriquet, the Gainesville Ripper. Rowling was a delinquent living in Gainesville who had trouble keeping a job and had been arrested several times for robberies and once for stalking and peeping. Naughty naughty. In 1990, Rowling began a string of violent killings, exclusively against petite Caucasian college-aged brunettes. He would break into their homes, kill them, and defile their bodies. He would pose his victims in tableau and these like disgusting scenes in the hopes that the police would be shocked by what he had left for them. Most horrifyingly though, all of this happened in the span of a few days, shocking the college town. It wasn't until later when a killing in a different town of Shreveport gave authorities enough information to put together key details and evidence connecting Rowling to both crimes and apprehend him. He was arrested and put to death. On trial, he said his goal was superstardom and he wanted to be a celebrity like Ted Bundy. Screenwriter for Scream, Kevin Williamson, said that while hearing the news about the Gainesville Ripper, he looked around his house and noticed a window open in his home that he couldn't remember leaving open, instantly terrifying him and causing his imagination to run wild, thinking about a killer prowling around town on young college women, seeking attention, treating it like a game. Now, while Ghostface might be kind of a fun horror movie icon, the real criminal behind him is downright horrifying. Coming in at the #1 spot today is going to be Borderland, which is a kind of unknown horror movie from 2007. You might not have heard of it. I'll throw the IMDb synopsis right here real quick. On a trip to a Mexican border town, 3 college friends stumble upon a human sacrifice cult. That's a classic premise for a horror movie, right? Sounds really scary. Tourists on vacation? Well, you already knew it because of the context of this video. It was pulled from the headlines, based on a horrific string of killings and ritualistic human sacrifice perpetrated by a satanic cult. The film is inspired and based around Adolfo Jesus Constanza, a Cuban-American criminal who was involved in the trade and led a cult in the 1980s. He was born in 1962 and operated primarily in Mexico and claimed he was a practicer of black magic. Constanzo's cult, the Narco-Satanists, engaged in all manner of horrific criminal activity, obviously including smuggling and human sacrifice. They believed that these rituals would grant them success and luck in their enterprises. Mark Kilroy was an American college student who on spring break was tragically abducted by this cult and subjected to unimaginable suffering for his brutal death. Kilroy was in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a group of friends traveling to Matamoros, a border town across from Brownsville, Texas. Now, Mark was young and athletic, which made him appealing to the cult that was seeking out these traits for their sacrifices. He was captured, taken to a remote ranch, killed ritualistically, and discovered in a mass grave alongside other victims. The case was shocking, and it's this horrific glimpse into the darkest recesses of reality that inspired the film Borderland, reminding us sometimes that we really can't write anything scarier than what humans get up to on their own.